Ballad of the Bard, by Laurel Arkall, Book 1, Prologue. The scratching of pen on paper filled the silence. A pause and then a long guttural groan followed. "No, what a rotten end," Andrew growled. He pounded his hands on the table as he tried not to shout. It was such a good life too. Well, until the end. His heart ached. Why did he ever take up the newly crystalled lives? Now he would have to wait to see if there was anything good about that situation. He quickly scribbled down the end, anger in his writing, and dismissed the crystal. As it began to float away, he got up and left, his cloak fluttering around him. He paused. He itched one of his 6 horns and grumbled. As his gaze was cast back at the crystal, he moved a hand to summon it to him. He looked one last time and gritted his teeth. That mother gave her everything, even her life, for that child. Perhaps, just this once wouldn't hurt. He would need to hurry though. He pulled on a blue fingerless glove and moved the hand, feeling the powers surge around it. With a look at his medallion he contemplated his choices. The domain of time still stood around him and he gave a crooked grin. He would get in trouble for this if word got out, but he couldn't just let this slide. He left his time domain active, and organized a link to the location where the mother was last hurt. He nearly chuckled when he saw what world she was on and which forest she had fled to. This would be easier than he thought. He went back to his desk while the lines connected and placed the manuscript down. He looked back through the crystalled mind and stretched. He'd been sitting for too long. Now he was going into action. After a few more stretches he heard a sound of wind and saw the lines had connected. With a mischievous grin he headed to the connection point and slipped into the realm. He closed his golden eyes, his white hair tousling for that brief connecting moment, and his horns atop his head rang as he heard the screeching. As his eyes opened, he was greeted with the battlefield from the mother's last moments. The smell of blood was still in the air. He frowned as the shadowy things circled around them, keeping a respectful and cautious distance away. He briefly felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. At least, they seemed intelligent. He walked towards the lifeless body of the mother, and heard the muffled whimpers of the boy underneath her. His heart ached again. So young to have lost his parents, but that was this lad's story. He pulled back the mother and noticed one of the shades come at him. Anja summoned the energy of the moon and a light exploded from him. The terrifying screech of the creature as the light racked it with pain was very satisfying, but where had they come from? This world had no creations like them here. He would need to pay more attention to what was going on. There was a tiny shriek from the exposed child and Anja looked back. He sighed and reached for the power of the night and put the child to sleep. It would be better if he didn't see much and it would be safer on the crystal record, if no one saw him. He then turned his attention to the circling shades. They, however, didn't seem to have crystals, else he would have found out about them earlier. Let's see just how rusty I've gotten. He grinned, drawing on the power of the moon and encircling them with light. He cast a separate glow on the boy to prevent the shades from coming too close. As he began to take them out, their howls were the stuff of nightmares. Their movements were fleeting as if made of the shadows themselves. And those lifeless red eyes never blinked, never wavered from their target. Anja dodged as one came in close. Its swipe moved the ground behind him, but when he returned a counter-strike, it fell on nothing. The creature's body moved around his hand. Once again he called on the power of the moon, and the thing shrieked as it was enveloped in light. Dissipating as if it really was just a shadow, the others hesitated and then fled, faster than they had appeared. Frankly, it was a bit disheartening when they turned and ran. He was very curious about them, but it was also impossible to catch them. They seemed to be able to shift between physical and non-physical forms. That was already breaking many laws of this world, and made them the top of the hierarchical threat chain, which also did not make sense. With one look, he gathered his bearings and smirked. At least, he was in these woods. He had a reliable being here he could ask about all this to. He then called on the power of the ground, and opened a hole to place the deceased mother into and offered her a proper burial, before grabbing her son. The boy was young. If memory was right, he should be 5 or 6 years old. Anja sighed as he cradled the boy in his arms, and hummed a tune while walking deeper into the woods. He purposely kept to the places where other living beings were not, avoiding attention as he approached the center of the wood. Anja, is that you? Anja looked at the largest and oldest tree in the woods. He knew it was the origin of that voice, magnificent and enormous, buds of gold leaves that would turn green as the summer came. A few ancient bugs and creatures floated around as orbs, giving this place a sense of timelessness. "Hello Jay, it's been a while. Look, I can't stay long, but can you watch over this boy?" he said as he set the child against the roots. His gaze flickered up at the trunk as he spoke. "Anja," a voice reverberated in this nearly hallowed ground, so familiar, despite the change in form. "And while I am here, the other creators here didn't happen to make anything that can move between physical and mental realms. Shadowy creatures?" Anja asked as he set the boy's hair as he slept. "Such a precious soul." He smiled till he heard Jay's voice again. "Well, no, but," Anja sighed, "something else was at play here." "Figured as much. Well, this is going to be a bit longer of a case than I was hoping for." He stretched as he contemplated all the work coming his way. He realized the dirt and dust on his blue robes, and wondered how he would explain this to the others. "Anja, why are you here?" the tree he called Jay asked. Anja smiled as he looked back. Life was finally getting interesting again. Anja sighed as he glanced at the boy against the oldest tree in the wood. He looked at him with a fond smile. He couldn't help it. Having seen the love the mother had for the boy, it had rubbed off on him. He looked up at the tree and could sense the barely divine presence inside. "Dash it all, they want me on new crystals," he said, folding his arms and looking down at the kid. "When I saw his mother's rotten ending, I couldn't stand still," Anja said with a saddened expression. "You always were like that," Jay hummed. Yeah, normally I'd cuff you for that, but can't do that anymore," he said as he looked at the old tree. "You wouldn't," the voice said, and Anja sighed. Jay was right, though he was still upset at the outcome of Jay's story. It wasn't fair that Celine and her sister, Sina, had fallen for that man, and now look at them. Celine was dead. Sina was a tree on this planet, and so was Jay, the very planet they had fought to protect the inhabitants of. He still didn't know where Sina had sequestered herself away to. Maybe one day he would figure it out and talk with her again, like the good old days. But then again, he wasn't even supposed to be here. As a defector of the Damon clan, he was supposed to fulfill the role of a passive observer, a recorder of history. Sina had made a place for them to do that. It was her extended hand of mercy that allowed him to have any hope. He wanted to curse Celine for driving them all to this, but again, that was ancient history. At least now he had a valid reason to be here. He just knew the Damon clan was behind the appearance of those shades. Who else would create such terrifying monsters to wreak havoc on the people? He'd have to warn the others and could get a pass on his behavior this time. But he doubted he could do it again after this. "How are the others?" Jay asked, and Anja sighed. "The same as always, though most prefer to be a few generations back on the records," he sighed in disgust. "Can't handle a bad ending, though, I'm just as guilty of that." He chuckled and felt as if Jay was patting him on the shoulder. "So, what is the story on the boy you brought here?" Jay asked. Anja looked at the child again and patted his hand on the kid's head. "All his people have been killed by those creatures I was asking you about. His mum brought him here to your woods before dying to them, and I scared off the rest. I can't stay, so it wouldn't be the first person I have cared for here," Jay said, and Anja sighed in relief. "And, well, he's a good kid, shouldn't be too much trouble. Just don't mention me to him. I don't need any more trouble with what I've done," he said as he opened one of the portals back to his space. He waved goodbye, casting one more glance at the child. "Of course," Jay said before Anja left, closing the portal behind him. Chapter 1, Capture. The morning mists played on Bart's mind. His eyes darted as he perceived something moved, just out of sight. This wouldn't be a typical day in these woods. He could already pick out the sounds of the inhabitants' song rousing the forest from its slumber. He gritted his teeth. "Did they finally notice me?" he contemplated as he strapped the last items to his faithful mount. He then grabbed his token from father and tucked it into his shirt with the others. The shades were gone now, gone with the morning light, and now a new threat rose. Dryads. His usual tricks wouldn't work against them, not in this environment. Though if he found that one dryad, perhaps this could be resolved peacefully. His hand tightened the ropes and he checked around them, making sure not to forget anything. That was a baseless wish. Dryads always turned on humans like him, even while contemplating about if he could find her. He recalled the first time they met. She certainly was an odd one. She had found him here months ago, and yet, despite the normal reaction to kill each other on sight, she had observed him and finally approached him. No hint of malice, just curiosity. As he mounted his faithful companion, he rubbed the silver fur and gained his attention. He briefly paused to listen to the sounds around them. The forest song buzzed around them, quiet but wrong, like a shade night turning grim. He gritted his teeth, discomfort prickling under his skin. Something was off, and it wasn't just the mist playing tricks. "Looks like they've noticed us, Kai," he said calmly. He felt a hum under him as the large wolf-like head rose and looked at him with the most telling expression. His long legs were eager to be off, and his long snaking tail shifted with a flick of annoyance. "I doubt she told anyone about us," Bard said, voice catching. He covered his mouth quick. Kai hummed again, calling his bluff. He didn't buy it either. "Did she sell me out?" he muttered, ignoring the pointed look. She'd been good company those 3 months. Her laughter around the stream echoed in his mind, big eyes locked on his flute when he played. Fast tunes pulled her giggles, slow ones held her still. He'd been too easy, too close. Kai was right. He'd given her too much slack. A dryad, too curious about humans like him, and that never ended well. The song swelled sharp, waking the woods, and his old distrust settled back in where he was safer, sharper. The saddle creaked under his hand, Kai's bulk steady. The one constant in his life was Kai's presence. The forest hummed an off-putting tune and he gritted his teeth. Grateful for the warning, but disliking the sound. "Best get moving," Bard said as he rubbed Kai's back. Kai harumphed, but took off, long legs eating the ground. He held onto the harness for dear life as Kai ran through the woods. Every once in a while, the tokens at his chest made a slight whistling sound, and he tried to muffle the wind from interacting with it. He didn't need any more indicators that he was here or there. It would only make it harder to escape. These ancient woods with this mist felt like it was about to devour them, like a shade brushing its incorporeal body against him. They weaved over rock and under branch. Kai stumbled over rocks, mist blinding his snout. Bard gritted his teeth, stomach twisting. This wasn't their day, and he still hadn't accomplished his mission yet. He shook his head as he saw something move next to him. A flick, like a catfolk tail, ghosted past. Couldn't be. Not this far. His chest tightened. Those caravans left him too, tails fading in dust. The mists clung to him and then moved, as if the forest was breathing. It was eerily similar and made his skin crawl. Too similar to being hunted like those days. As he leaned down closer to Kai's back, avoiding a lower branch, he heard the distinct movement of the trees behind them. He looked back and noticed the sounds coming from the sides as well. "Looks like they plan to surround us," Bard said, louder than the sound of the wind. He felt Kai put in a burst of speed, and he was sure they would break free. That was until he heard the sounds of their songs. Dryads were terrifying. Their songs cut through, sharp and alive. Trees creaked, waking like warriors. Fathers' tales weren't lies. 600 years hadn't dulled this. The destruction was still evident in the abandoned cities and waste places of the world. Here, in their silver woods, no friendly trunk would hide him. Every route followed the elder he couldn't find. 3 months chasing that chance, her laugh, her chats as he played his flute, and these woods still blocked him. Voices rang out, their melodic songs and dryadic words flitting harmoniously, a dangerous sound. If he could hear their singing, they would have to be much closer than he had thought. Kai jerked to a stop, paws skidding. Bard rocked upright, saddle creaking under him. A cliff loomed sharp out of the mist, cutting them off. Thousands of trees hummed behind, no echo, just numbers. Bard shifted in the saddle, looking back as Kai adjusted. The mist had obscured their vision, but now he could clearly see the moving trees. He paused to pay attention to the words they sung. The dryad words were command to the trees, and if he could predict their next movement, then perhaps he could weave out of this with Kai. Dryadic words sang that they were about to slay him. The roots would wall them in and then execute them. Silver bark and silvery green leaves emerged from the mists, and white stone boulders made some trees feel taller than normal, a suffocating atmosphere. Bard clicked his tongue. They were trapped. Dryadic words sang death, roots to trap, branches to crush. He'd learned running wouldn't work. Those trees could outpace them even with Kai's incredible speed and size. Too late now, the forest breathed, choking the air, with their occasional appearances like silver jaws closing in on them. Bard slid off Kai with a burst of speed. His legs felt steady, but tense, anticipating an attack. Kai wouldn't be targeted without him on his back. Now if only he could see that girl. Perhaps he could get her to show him the way to the elder. He smirked, sharp and bitter, a dumb hope. She'd have shown him there by now if she cared to. Bard's heart sank as the trees closed in. There was no escape now. A call sounded, trumpeting his demise. But, out of the mists, Sen appeared, rushed and breathless. How had she known they were here? Had she followed them? Her silvery green hair floated as if underwater. Their songs faltered. Silvery green heads turned to heed her. Bard's eyes grasped their shifting hesitation. His eyes narrowed at the change of attention. She darted between the dryads, her voice sharp and commanding in their tongue, her quick words in her native tongue. There was too much pull for the girl he'd sized up. His gut twisted. He hadn't figured her place here, and that gnawed at him. She waved at him. Stay put. He froze. He chanted in his head, no sudden movement. He needed to seem harmless. Sen, one of the others began, his words still too fast to follow beyond her name. Dryad spoke quickly. Their words a melody Bard was only beginning to decipher. Every sentence was like trying to catch leaves in the wind. No. Estamicus Muse, Sen, the dryad protecting him, said firmly. Slowly, Bard paused. Here she was saying he was her friend, and yet they had only gotten to know each other in the past few months. His eyes narrowed a bit, but his studying stopped as she came closer. Some began to sing again and Sen ran the rest of the way over and climbed onto his back, as if to shield him from the incoming branches. Sen, that's enough, Bard said, and she climbed higher, nearly onto his shoulders, and he looked up at her face. She really didn't have a concept about personal space. He stood up straight and let her slide down. One of the warriors slid down his tree and approached. Bard watched him come over with that same floating hair and wise aura. The presence was calm and confident, but his face seemed to be hesitant and worried. Bard stifled a little chuckle before he stopped within striking range. The warrior hesitated, his gaze flicking from Sen to Bard. There was an unspoken debate, a dance of authority that Bard couldn't fully grasp. He froze as Sen spoke. The warrior's words were a blur, but Bard caught the gist. They wanted his weapons. Bard sighed and then almost laughed. He had no weapons, but he doubted the dryad before him would understand that. If only he had kept up on his language skills. He was lamenting his choices as he tried to explain his situation. Non-armor habit, Sen spoke up. Schultus hedus, apprehendia superlectalum swam, affert you mad interrogandum. Bard held still. He needed to play this right, for both his sake and Kai's. Bard closed his eyes, forcing himself to remain calm, but heard Kai yelp behind him. Bard flinched, head snapping back. Trees with their dryadic commanders crowded Kai, roots coiling towards him. Kai was already warning them off. Kai, let them take it. Cooperate, he said, and Kai gave him a furious glare. Cooperate, Bard said again. Kai sat down with a very displeased harumph. Kai was definitely upset, not at the prospect of giving up, but rather that he had run to try to escape, and now they were giving up so quickly. Bard understood this, but he hoped the giant beast would cooperate. He needed more reasons for the dryads to not kill him, and trying to escape would only fuel their suspicions. He calmly stood there as they searched him and unstrapped and pulled everything off. He tried hard not to react as they grabbed his instruments from Kai. He had salvaged them from the dead cities for the last decade. They were priceless relics of an age long past. Thankfully they had some decency and let him pull his shirt and clothes around to show he wasn't hiding anything. However, as they demanded the tokens around his neck, he hesitated and they drew their weapons. He gritted his teeth and pulled them off, handing them over, his eyes watching like a hawk as they took them. Eventually the dryad sung, and had a few trees carry Kai, while he was forced to walk with branches binding his hands together. He could hear Sen arguing with the dryads, but he couldn't keep up with their fast-paced words and phrases. Each time one even looked at him with some hostility. Sen spoke up. Their reluctance to heed her word was evident, but why would they even listen in the first place? She was just a young dryad, wasn't she? Just who had he made friends with? Eventually he was guided to a tree that was rendered into a large prison-like structure. Once inside, Kai howled and tried to come after him, but the dryads and trees were quick to subdue him. Bard leaned against the wooden poles and grabbed Kai's attention. He knew the 8-foot-tall wolf could break these flimsy branches, but if he did, then it would spell more trouble. He needed time to figure a way out of this situation. Kai, that's enough. It's all right. Sit, he said harshly. A dryad attempted to come at him, but she stopped when Kai whimpered and lay down. Bard ruefully smiled. Close enough, he muttered. The dryad closest to him sung, and his bindings released as he watched his things be taken to the upper branches of the forest. He reached for the tokens only to be reminded that they were gone, in their hands now. Pained, he found a comfortable spot and sat down, patient and hopeful that he could navigate this. His mind already awhirl as he analyzed the situation. Chapter 2, A Curious Techer. Deep within the heart of the Dryad Council chambers, fingers ran over the various objects. None seemed familiar until a small pack filled with craft table items was identified. Forest craft, a strange hobby for a techer. The dryad harumphed before sitting down and closing his eyes. His golden hair draped down, lifeless as a techer's. The tree he was in noticed his attitude and made itself a bit more comfortable for him. The sounds of footsteps drew him out of his quiet contemplation. He looked up at the old dryad before him, antlers barely avoiding the doorway as he walked in, also sporting lifeless golden hair. "Father, I'm glad that you have come," Amir said, rising to his feet. "The matter of this techer boy has me somewhat perplexed. I'm aware your daughter has been begging me for the last hour or so to make you spare his life. She seemed to have developed some feelings for this boy." Amir's rage could not be contained behind his meticulous mask. This was not the first blunder, and only cemented the idea that she was too young to be in charge. "It's not the only thing that concerns me," Amir said as he stilled the anger. "He carries no weapon I'm familiar with, and these, I cannot divine what purpose they are used for." He indicated to the table with the array of instruments and other items from Bard's belongings. Elwood strode over to the table, curious but with a wave of nostalgia as he saw the items. "Curious?" he said softly, placing a hand to stroke his beard. "Great," Amir muttered, his father casting a glance at his son. "Just great," he yelled, flopping down on a chair. Elwood chuckled to himself. "You do seem to misinterpret everything I say, my boy," he chided with a smile. "If you would stop talking in circles, I swear I'm going to." He left the statement unsaid. If not for the fact that Elwood was the only dryad in these woods who was older than the war and had vast knowledge, he knew his son would have sent him off to a helpless battle to have him killed. No matter what the Grand Elder did, his son, their temporary leader, seemed perpetually annoyed and frustrated with him. He thanked the wisdom of the Elder that his son was not stupid, despite being a bit short-tempered when it came to humans and his granddaughter. The report said this techer was found miles within the sentry's border, the Grand Elder asked, becoming serious and praying that he could watch through the details without pushing more of his son's buttons. "Not just the sentries but the guardians as well," he said. "Was Sen the one who led him in?" Amir asked. "That was my initial suspicion. But she said she found him there and was curious, so she didn't report him," Elwood responded, knowing that he would be the one to have more details on Sen's account of what took place. Amir growled out a sigh and shook his head. "She's going to get killed if this keeps up," Amir finally stated. "You give your daughter too little credit," Elwood said softly. Amir didn't respond, opting to plow forward with the conversation and not his apparent shortcomings. "The other thing is that dog," Amir said, resting his elbows and touching his fingertips together. "Dog," Elwood said confused. "The one he rides and who seems to possess an intellect comparable to any sentient being. He strictly obeys the techer without question, and the techer speaks to him like he would to any other techer. So it understands speech," the Grand Elder said, folding his arms in disbelief. "I've seen Sen speak to it as well, and even I can't deny the light of intellect in its eyes." "Is it dangerous?" Elwood asked, his hands grazing over more items. "Well, it initially tried to attack the scouts that found the boy, but the techer called him off, which is probably for the best. The size of the beast alone makes me believe it would take several of our warriors to suppress him." Even now the dog has taken up a post outside the Tekker's cell, and won't let anyone near the boy unless the boy calls him off. The one exception is Sen, who seems to have no problem interacting with the beast, Amir said, letting out an exasperated sigh. If the dog is as intelligent as you have let on, he must have determined that Sen is not an enemy to be guarded against, Elwood observed. Besides, you know Sen has always had a way with animals. Did Sen say how long the Tekker had been here? Amir asked after he digested what Elwood had said. She apparently found him a little over 2 months ago. He picked up the Babble and looked at it curiously. 2 months, Amir shouted, coming to his feet. Do you have any idea how much information he could have gathered in that time? He has clearly found a way to bypass our defenses, and to remain undetected even in the heart of our forest. If such information were to get to the other Tekker, the security of the whole forest would be in jeopardy. Amir paced back and forth as he faced the prospects of having to face a full invasion. Elwood had to admit that such a situation would be a dangerous one. Certainly the Tekker would not be opposed to such actions. Since the war had started some 600 years ago, he had seen many such attempts on the forest, but their defenses had never before failed. Before we jump to conclusions, what other actions have we observed from the Tekker? What do you mean? Amir asked, sitting down and resting his head on one hand. Any escape attempts? Any further attacks from that dog? Any resistance either? No, but, he began. Elwood rolled his eyes. Patience, my son, patience. If he does have that info, we would have seen him making attempts to escape and deliver the news. Assuming he has anywhere to go, Elwood calmly stated. His curiosity was beginning to grow towards this fellow. Is this everything he had with him? Elwood asked, moving to look over the other various items spread out on the table. Yes, although it took some effort to get everything off the dog. Even with the Tekker telling him to behave, Amir said. The boy knows forest craft? Elwood asked, indicating the stack of fire sticks. Amir's eyes held wonder and fear. Eventually the fear overtook the wonder as it turned to hostility. Elwood sighed. It's not unheard of for the Tekker to have such skills, although it is rare. Elwood said as his eyes continued to scan over the items. Elwood's eyes widened as they landed on the various instruments. He picked up the instrument like it was made of glass. His eyes were wide with a mix of awe and caution, as if it were a piece of history he thought lost. Amir watched, cautious but curious. Elwood thought it better not to explain. If his son knew what these could do, he would likely go after the Tekker right away. He fingered the carefully patched places on each of the instruments. Amir was quiet. Has he played one? Elwood asked as he grabbed a long tubular instrument and placed fingers over the holes. He had seen a few of these in the old days, and his own curiosity had him observe what the Tekker did with them. But he wasn't entirely sure how they worked. No, we haven't let him touch them. We avoided any possibility that he could use them as a weapon. Then, as if a thought struck him, the color drained from his features. Elwood inwardly groaned. His son was too smart sometimes. Who knows what havoc he could have caused if he got control of one of our soldier trees. Is this how he got in undetected? You fret too much, Amir, Elwood said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. I watched many Tekker attempt the very notion you are treading on, and die without success. He returned the wooden tube to the table. They're as harmless in his hands as they are on this table, though they can make quite a noise if he so chose, which would only get annoying, but nothing more. Amir looked at his father in quiet relief. It was times like this that he was glad that the old fool was still around. Elwood glanced over the various instruments again. He knew that the Tekker considered music to be taboo, and had forbidden such items as this Tekker had in his possession. Not only that, but this Tekker knew how to repair them, and he obviously cared for them. Then his eyes strayed to a small piece of cloth which held several wooden tokens. He stiffened and reached for them. Amir's eyes were riveted on the old man. Had he spotted something important? Was this Tekker dangerous after all? Where did you get these? Elwood asked, a sense of awe in his words. From the Tekker. He wore them around his neck and was reluctant to hand them over, Amir said, his gaze never leaving his father's face. I would doubt anyone with enough sense of what these were would ever part with them, Elwood whispered. He secured the cloth around the tokens and put it in his pocket, then without a word began to walk back the way he came. Where are you going? Amir shouted after him. But Elwood's thoughts were too lost in the swirling questions he had for this Tekka. He wanted to speak to the lad and find out the truth straight from the source. And if he felt that he wasn't being honest, he had his ways of overcoming foolish minds. Amir stared at the table again. What had silenced and driven his father like that? He hated it when he was the ignorant one. But something had spooked the eldest dryad in the wood. Dread creeped its way into his heart and he called for one of his servants. He only hoped he could sort this out before someone got hurt. He hurriedly sent a cluster of guardsmen after his father with a messenger to find out what was going on. Then ordered his own personal guardsman to accompany him to the Tekka's prison. Chapter 3, Tokens. Bard sat in comfortable silence as he listened to the voices of the wood. Kai sat outside the wooden bars that blocked them from wrapping comfortably together. His thoughts turned to the beautiful dryad, Sen, who had been his unplanned companion the past few months. Her curiosity was what he knew the most, but now, he wondered what her hand had been in all this. Seeing as she had found them so easily after being surrounded. "What have you done, Sen?" he muttered to himself. Kai grunted and Bard looked over. Kai was looking around at the trees. "Yep, I sense it too," Bard replied. He knew that Kai was looking around for what disturbance was flitting through the music of the trees. Everything was off. It wasn't out of harmony, but there were some dissonant chords that fit together with the tune. But through a grating eerie sense to the world around him, he looked once more at the ceiling of his enclosure. The tree that had been asked to cage him was curious about him. He could feel that, yet it hadn't responded to his words. He wished for an instrument right now, something to aid him in communicating to the trees in this world around him. He knew he wasn't much of a singer, and without an instrument, he suddenly felt bare and alone. Perhaps the trees felt this way. Every interaction of the dryads with the trees had been commands, not communication. It wasn't the kind that a slave would hear. But it wasn't kind either. "What you doing?" a cheery voice asked, appearing just outside the bars. Bard smiled at the sight of Sen, her floating hair moving about as she peeked between bars. "Hello, Sen. Done speaking with whoever that was?" Bard asked. Sen's touch was gentle, almost reverent, as she sang a request to the tree. Her song was like a conversation, far from the commands Bard had seen, showing how dryads were supposed to treat nature as a partner, not a servant. It took a second, as if it was confused at the politeness of the song, before complying. She eagerly slid in and sat next to him. Kai grumbled as he watched the two of them. "He wishes you could let him in too," Bard indicated to Kai, translating for Sen. "Well, he knows I can't do that. I'd be in big trouble and so would you," she said, looking up at him with big eyes. Her hair floated around in grace, but there was a hint of red that was near the roots. She stopped and looked up, wondering what he was looking at. "What is it?" she asked, her eyes obviously not finding what held his gaze. "Your hair," he said at last, and she cocked her head to the side, the hair neatly avoiding running into either of their eyes, or face for that matter. "What about it?" she prompted. "It's turning red," he said, touching the part where it broke from hair to forehead. "Oh," she said quickly, understanding, lighting her eyes. "It does that at this time of year." "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, and she giggled. "I suppose a Tekka like you wouldn't understand," she said with a playful smile, and he sighed. As much as he told her his race referred to themselves as humans, she kept insisting that it was Tekka. He supposed she had attempted to say it once. But it seemed that not all human words were easy to speak. That went without saying, as his tongue also found itself tied when trying to say some of her words as well. "What wouldn't I understand?" he asked. "Your hair is dead and doesn't reflect the life of the forest," she said at length. "Dead?" he asked. That was an interesting way to put it, he mused. He always thought of how her hair seemed to have a life of its own. But so did many of the dryads, if it wasn't bound and tied up. "Yeah, it is one color and doesn't move. You also keep it short, really short," she said, seeming proud that she was able to converse with him more easily. Kai's ears twitched, and that brought Bard to alertness. Sen noticed his change in focus and looked about. Her eyes grew wide as her ears began to pick up the sounds of footsteps. She hastily walked to the bars, telling the tree to let her out. Again there was confusion, but more to the fact that she didn't ask nicely like she had before. It reluctantly gave in and she slipped out, but not before she was spotted. "Sen," a voice spake, and she ducked her head, but then quickly looked to where the sound had come from. Several words were exchanged as an older-looking dryad approached them. Unlike others Bard had seen, his hair was like gold, flat and smooth, not alive and green like the others. From his head grew branches, not antlers, making him look like a wise, old tree himself. Kai began to growl and Sen quickly looked towards Bard. He knew that expression and quickly came to the edge of his cell. Kai, calm down. It's all right, he said quickly. Kai looked back at the two of them and Bard shook his head. Marvelous, he heard the dryad say, and Bard quickly looked at the owner of the voice, his mouth gaping in surprise. Close your mouth. Is it really surprising that an old fellow like me should understand your language, lad? The older dryad asked. Grandfather, Sen grumbled as she gave a small bow. The old dryad laughed and patted her head. It caught me off guard, said Bard replied, bowing. No need for formalities, I've come to question you, the dryad remarked. And first your name, he said. Bard shook at the surprise and took a serious tone. Bard is my name, sir, he replied. He heard the dryad sigh. Just call me Elwood, Bard. None of that's a business, Elwood said. I must say, Bard is an interesting name. What is your last name? He asked. I don't have one, Bard said, remembering father's warnings. Surely not. Every human uses one to distinguish families, Elwood remarked. I was orphaned as a child. Father Tree was the one who gave me my name, Bard said. Elwood's brows shot up and then a curious light glittered across his eyes. I see. I'm sorry to hear about your loss. But I am far more interested in this Father Tree you spoke of, Elwood said. He motioned to the tree in the bar's left. A table of wood grew from the ground, the leaves carefully tucking themselves into the surface as 3 stools grew up beside it. Bard heard Elwood thank the tree. Bard felt the nuzzling of Kai before he could even look over to see his companion. As he strode over to the stool meant for him, Kai refused to leave his side. Elwood watched with some interest, but mostly amusement. The 3 of them sat down as the questions began. So, who is this Father Tree? Elwood reiterated. He is an elder tree of one of the forests in the north, Bard began to explain. He had nothing to hide, and he felt that this dryad was much more understanding than the others he had encountered, beyond Sen. Besides, Father Tree had always explained it was better to be honest, and gain the trust of a dryad than an enemy. He took me in after my mother fled to his woods and died of her wounds. Then afterwards, he raised me as his son, and taught me of a great many things. Is he the one who taught you about music? Elwood prompted. Yes, Bard answered. So, then, why are you here instead of at home with him? It's sort of a long story, Elwood, Bard said, his voice tinged with the weight of his journey and the memories of home. Kai's ears twitched and he huddled closer to Bard. The calm was shattered by the approach of more dryads, their steps heavy with suspicion. Bard felt the air change, a storm brewing where once there was peace. A deep rumble permeated Kai's being and Bard touched his neck, quietly compelling his faithful friend to be still. Kai immediately ceased, but his eyes never wavered from the newcomers. Elwood sighed as he rose from his stool and stood between Bard and the other dryads. Bard picked up on a few words, and understood that the others were challenging Elwood about his decision to let the Tekka out. They also demanded information, but he wasn't sure what it was about. Elwood seemed to tell them to back off and leave him be. But the one who seemed to be the leader of this group shook his head. Chapter 4. A pledge. We have our orders, so the messenger said. Of course you do, Elwood thought. He wondered just how much Bard understood of the situation. Perhaps Sen had explained it to him, or rather, could explain it to him. In the meantime, he had to find a way to continue his conversation without these fools on him. Sometimes, he thought, his son could be a real pain. I am supervising this. He motioned to where Bard and Sen still sat, while gathering information. Why don't you go tell our leader this? He finished dismissively. But sir, the prisoner, and we've been ordered to oversee your protection, the messenger began. Does it look like I need protecting? Elwood's voice dripped with sarcasm. Well, no sir, but, he insisted, you are our only elder and he is a Tekka. Besides, there is the matter of the dog. The Tekka has called his pet off. I am in no real danger here. Quietly Elwood began to seethe. His son had chosen his guardsmen well, too well. They were insistent and in this case a bother. He wondered how he could get them off his case and leave them be. He figured Bard would be more willing to divulge his secrets without more company, and right now, he had a question he needed answered. But so this time another member of the guard said, "What's to stop the attacker from simply ordering the dog to attack when your guard's down or to try and make a run for it? The fact is that he is a attacker and can't be trusted." "That may be true," countered Elwood, "but I need information that I know he will be much more willing to give if he is not locked up in a cage." Elwood's temper was starting to flare, and he said that last statement a bit louder than he intended. Bard frowned as he watched the exchange between guards and Elwood. "Well, this is going nowhere fast," Bard said to himself. "They're scared that Kai might hurt Grandpa," Sen whispered. Kai looked at Bard with an apologetic look. "Well, it's not your fault that you are a bit intimidating," Bard said to his faithful friend with a pat to the furry head. He looked back at the guards and Elwood as their voices rose in volume. He thought about the avenues left to him and sighed. "Sorry, my friend, but it seems it can't be helped." Bard shrugged. Rising to his feet, he quietly walked to the group before him. Sen reached out but stopped as she decided to see what he had in mind. "Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt this, but might I offer a suggestion?" Bard said in fluent Esternum with a simple flourishing bow. All four heads turned to look at him, surprise marking their features, and in some, was that a bit of shame. Ignoring their bewildered state, he continued, "If it is my friend the dog who bothers you so, then he is willing to be caged while I continue my discussion with Elwood." Here, he motioned to Elwood and then bowed. His mind raced through the implications of his words. He needed peace, not a fight. "If you find this more assuring, of course," he said as an afterthought. It was their territory that he was in after all. He inwardly thanked Father for teaching him enough Esternum to handle situations like this. If only he hadn't gotten so rusty in it, then maybe he could have followed it earlier when tensions were high. Sen kept back the majority of her laughter in the guise of a chuckle-coughing fit, which drew some glances towards her, but then the eyes fixed back on him. "Well," one of the guards coughed, "I don't know where a techer like you learned our language," but was silenced by Elwood's sharp gesture. The guards' faces twisted in surprise, their disdain for a techer speaking Esternum clear. But Elwood's gesture cut through their prejudice. "If you're pet and you are fine with that, it shouldn't be a problem then," Elwood said. Bard nodded, keeping his head more down and respectful. Elwood turned back to the guards, his eyes narrowing, his calm voice carrying an unspoken command. "You may stay, but respect our laws. I will personally be informing our leader what I discover," Elwood said with a note of finality in his tone. The guards looked at one another and one shrugged. "Very well, Elder Elwood," one of them said, raising his finger to his chin and bowing his head. Bard took note and acknowledged that human movements for respect varied compared to dryadic movements. Sen stood next to Bard, and he wondered when she had gotten there. She looked up at him and placed her hands behind her back, smiling. "Well done," she whispered in human tongue. Bard nodded, mutely, then looked at Elwood, who sighed. "If you will have him move over to the tree, then I will have him caged," Elwood said with a bit of a remorseful tone. "It's not your fault," Bard said in human tongue, and Elwood inclined his head to the side. The two walked over to where Kai sat patiently. Bard looked back at the prison and Kai sighed. He rose to his feet and the other guards shifted behind them. Kai glared once at them, purposefully avoiding looking at Elwood, as if to say he didn't like the guardsman but found the strange and older dryad to be fine. Without another sound, Kai padded into the cage and sat, watching silently as Elwood asked the tree to bar the way. After thanking the tree, the two returned to the table and Bard noted how occasionally Elwood would glance towards where the guards had situated themselves. "Sorry about the interruption, where were we?" Elwood asked, and Bard thought back. Before he could respond, Elwood's eyes glinted with recollection. "Ah yes, you mentioned a father tree and I asked why you had left." "Right," Bard muttered, wondering why Elwood seemed on edge. Bard paused, his eyes darting to the forest around them, as if listening to a melody only he could hear. He chose his words carefully. "Father raised me until he sent me on a journey to see the world." "I see," Elwood remarked, then leaned forward, his gaze piercing, as if trying to read between the lines of Bard's story. Bard wondered what Elwood wanted to hear. He was probing for something. "Before I continue, Elwood sir, you wouldn't happen to know where my belongings were taken?" Bard asked. "They are safe," Elwood assured, a glint of light in his eyes. "You travel without a weapon. It's not as if I can travel without protection of some sort, is what you want to know, correct?" Bard asked, and Elwood nodded. "How do you travel safely?" Elwood pressed, his curiosity evident. Sen's voice was soft but firm. "Grandpa, he's trustworthy." Her words carried the weight of her belief in Bard, her eyes challenging Elwood to see what she saw. Elwood's hand paused on Sen's head, his response to her a whisper of doubt. "I need to see it for myself," Bard sighed. "I do apologize," Elwood Bard said, drawing the attention back to him. "You seem curious about me, and I am not sure if that is good or bad," Bard said, relaxing. "I see," Elwood mumbled. "Well, it can be good or bad, depending on what I can gather here. If having them around bothers you, I can see what I can do too." "No, it's all right," Bard said. He really had nothing to hide, but this whole experience was strange. He had thought those branch-like antlers had stood out to him, and he recalled that Father had mentioned that the oldest and wisest dryad grew them as they matured, meaning this dryad was wise and respected. "Very well," Elwood said, and sat comfortable as one could on a stool. "I do not know how to use a weapon, so therefore, I have chosen not to carry one," Bard said, resting his arm on the table. "Interesting," Elwood commented. "I would show you how I am able to travel with relative safety, but I am afraid that my belongings aren't here." Bard sighed. "Thus the question as to where they were," Elwood remarked and motioned for him to continue. "It was a gift from Father Tree," Bard explained. Elwood's mouth curled into a knowing smile, causing Bard to stumble with his words. "It is hard to describe, so," Bard shrugged. "Basically, it is a wooden item that contains the song of Father." Bard chose his words carefully. "Some secrets were not his to share." "Is that how you obtained these?" Elwood asked, procuring a small piece of fabric from a pouch and setting it on the table. Elwood's fingers traced the fabric, avoiding touching the tokens. His eyes held a light of reverence that spoke of ancient knowledge. Bard froze and then sighed in relief in recognition. "Well, no, actually, I was given those," he began. The conversation was cut short by a shout that sliced through the air like a blade. "Father, what are you doing?" Bard's heart skipped. The voice was sharp, filled with authority and disdain. Bard turned to see the source of the new voice. A tall dryad flanked by several more guardsmen strutted towards them. He had a regal bearing about him that would have been awe-inspiring had it not been his presence too much like a storm cloud, his scowl turning the air cold. Bard also noted that he too had golden hair like Elwood's, although he didn't have antlers. The man glared at Bard. Bard recognized the harsh dryadic sternum, a language he was still mastering, as Amir's orders echoed, "Restrain the Tekka." Before Bard could react, hands were on him, pushing him down. The world tilted, and all he could do was listen, the ground cold against his cheek. Bard's breath caught as he was forced down, his mind racing for any way to defuse the situation. "Amir," it was Elwood speaking, "think about what you are doing. I am Father. Take her away," this Amir person said coldly. "No, let me go," Sen cried out. Bard imagined a few guards grabbing her and dragging her away. Bard heard a deep growl from the cage and several of the dryads on him flinched, probably looking back at the caged creature. Bard took this chance and turned his head to look towards Kai. Kai's growl was a deep rumble, his fur bristling, eyes locked on the guards with a promise of violence. Their eyes locked and he shook his head slightly. Kai stopped, but his hackles never dropped. "Lock him up," Amir spoke, and as Bard was hoisted to his feet he saw Elwood approach, obviously angry. "And what do you intend to do to him?" Elwood asked, sharply. Amir slowly cast his gaze to Elwood to regard him. "What we should have done in the first place," Amir answered. "But he's of use to us," Elwood said harshly, voice sharp with urgency. "He's dangerous. That's all the information I need," Amir spat back, his face in a twisted snarl, red flush with anger, betraying his calm facade. Bard stumbled as the guards drew him to another tree, fearful of letting Kai have any chance to get at them. He glanced back and saw the clenched fists of Elwood. "Give me a few minutes with him," Elwood demanded. "He's not a threat," Elwood countered again, but it seemed to be falling on deaf ears. Bard's heart sank as he heard those words. He felt that Elwood was trying to preserve his life, though he wasn't sure why, but this Amir wanted him dead. He was used to having dryads wanting him dead, but it still stung. His mind reeled with ways he could get out of this situation. He heard someone growl, probably Amir. "I grow tired of this. He's lived far too long," Amir said, and the sound of a sword unsheathing from the scabbard rang in Bard's ears. There were sounds of struggle and Bard heard some cries of outrage, or was it surprise? Either way, he was surprised as he saw Sen appear next to him. Apparently he wasn't the only one who was shocked. "If you kill him, father, you'll have to kill me too," her voice rang out loud and clear. "Our lives have already been pledged and I will protect him or I will die with him." Sen's declaration hit like a thunderclap, her voice trembling yet resolute. Amir's face paled, the sword in his hand forgotten. If silence could be tangible, it would have suffocated them all. The guards exchanged looks, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief at Sen's bold claim. Bard felt a mix of relief and confusion wash over him, the term pledged echoing in his mind like a riddle. Amir's face contorted as an ugly hue of red burned into his skin. Without a word he turned towards Elwood, who held a pained expression of surprise. An unspoken message passed between the two and Elwood shrugged. Amir faced some of his guards lock him up. "Now, don't harm him," Amir growled, his command barely containing his rage. Sen instantly stiffened as a stern finger was pointed at her and a bead of sweat ran down her face as Amir commanded, "And you, go to your room and stay there until you are summoned." "Understood." Amir gave his daughter a look that indicated that there would be no arguing this point. Yes father," Sen said, slightly bowing her head. She looked back at Bard, and he could see the relief on her face. Bard's mind raced. Pledged? What did that mean? For now, it was his lifeline. Chapter 5, Reality. "Did you know about this?" Amir nearly shouted to Elwood when they arrived back in the council room. Elwood didn't approve of his son's outburst, but he was impressed that he had managed to keep his temper in check up until they were behind closed doors. "As I mentioned earlier, I noted that she had some feelings for the Tekka, although I didn't know it had progressed to where they had pledged their lives," Elwood stated calmly. "How can you stay so calm?" Amir reeled back his outward display of anger, but his eyes began to hold other emotions. He stumbled to a chair and sank into it, his hands reaching up to offer a support for his head as he slumped down. I just don't know," Amir said. Elwood waited. It would be prudent of him to wait while his son gathered his thoughts on the matter. His patience paid off. "I don't know what to do, Dad. When it comes to matters of war and protection, directing our people, it just comes naturally." Amir's face darkened with an underlying tone of sadness and frustration. "But when it comes to matters of my daughter, I don't know. I just don't know what to do." Elwood slowly walked over and sat in a chair perpendicular to his son. A long sigh escaped the older dryad's throat as he sunk into thought. "If only her mother was still here," Amir said softly. Elwood looked over at his son, his face now resting on two propped fists. "She could sort this out. She was always better at this anyway." "You mean matters of the heart?" Elwood pointed out softly. His son's head jerked at the words before he let out a sigh of resignation. "Yes, you can't change the past, my son," Elwood said more softly. As expected, his son rose in a flurry of anguished anger. "I know that," he cried out. "I know," he said more softly. "But there are days," his words trailed off and Elwood knew the feeling. It was not too different from his own. Those moments where your other half, who could handle a rough situation with more grace and expertise than yourself, was no longer there and the responsibility was shouldered by your own clumsy strength. It was a feeling that many dryads had come to know over the years due to the constant war with the Tekka, but it was ever more apparent in the lives of Amir and his daughter, and even in the life of Elwood. This constant war had cost so much. "So, what do you plan to do?" Elwood asked with a sympathetic look. "Give me a minute," Amir said, as he took a breath and tried to calm the torrent of emotions and thoughts racing through his head. After a minute of silence he finally found a starting point. "A pledge? With a Tekka? Are you aware of any other case such as this one?" Amir asked, looking at the aging dryad. Elwood sat back but did not have to think long on the question. "No. Not in all my years have I heard of or known of such an incident like this," he said thoughtfully. "Then surely it can't," Amir began, but Elwood held up his hand. "No law forbids it," Elwood said, his words heavy with the weight of tradition. Yet it would be highly unlikely. And yet, here we are with the highly unlikely, Amir grumbled. Elwood smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. I know. As it stands, though, to base it off the law, of which I am sure your daughter understands, Elwood started. I highly doubt she understands it. She is still a child, Amir argued, interrupting Elwood. Like it or not, your daughter is a grown woman, young I'll admit, but still of age. You are going to have to face this fact sooner or later, Elwood reminded. Amir growled. But with a Tekka, Amir whispered with the shock and disbelief evident in his words. He's not your normal Tekka, Elwood reprimanded, gently. Amir sat quietly, but listening. He is, by all accounts, a son of the forest. Not this forest per se, he quickly added before Amir could counter. But then, neither are we. Right, Amir sighed. But still, a Tekka being a child of the forest, how could that even be possible? My brief and interrupted conversation with him revealed a lot. Despite what happened, Elwood told with a gentle reminder that he did not appreciate what had transpired. Bard, that being his name, came from a forest north of here where he was raised by the elder tree, whom he refers to as Father Tree. He left and has been accepted by many other elders, hence these. Elwood mumbled as he felt around for the cloth with the wooden tokens. Amir looked with keen interest as he presented them. What are they? He asked, somewhat admitting he had misjudged his father's reaction to seeing the item before all the chaos had started. In older times, these were highly sought after by dryads, and few received them. I myself only have a few, Elwood said as he procured a familiar necklace with similar wooden chips strung on it. Amir noted the difference in the amount and curiosity for the Tekka. Bard began to set in, begrudgingly, but nonetheless. He amended his first impressions, but it did little to dispel the heavy dislike and anger towards the race of Tekkas, and the situation he found himself in. You've noticed how he has more than I? Elwood asked, and Amir caught the other meaning behind that. He must have stolen them, Amir spat, his prejudice clear, only to be countered by Elwood's patient explanation. If you think it's that simple to receive one, then I have done you a disservice, my son. It can only be gifted, and if I am correct, this bard has one more on his person, Elwood said. Where? Amir asked. He was slightly suspicious of the tokens, and he had ordered his men to remove all equipment from the Tekka. So to learn that they hadn't followed orders upset Amir. I'm not sure, but this pledge holds more weight than we would normally give credit to. Any son of the forest has every right to pledge their life to Sen, Elwood stated at last. The color drained from Amir then was replaced with red. I won't accept it, Amir said. Besides, I doubt he even understands what it means. But Sen would, and she was the one who claimed it, not Bard, Elwood pointed out. Amir growled, and then his hands flew to the roots of his hair, as he pulled on them in frustration. You only act this way because you worry for her, Elwood thought to himself. He wouldn't voice these thoughts, especially to his son, but it was only logical. Sen, a voice called, and she jumped in her seat, her head whipping around, her hair neatly floating out of her line of sight. Her eyes grew wide as she saw the dryad. She least expected to see her after being sent to her room. Dad, she said, surprised and confused. She sat closer to the edge of her seat, allowing her father a place to sit next to her. Amir sat next to her, a surprising gesture, since he usually chose another chair in the room and pulled it up next to her. Is everything all right? She asked at length. Amir looked at her and then sighed, his golden hair draping down in a more tamed way. Do you remember your mother? Amir asked, and Sen thought about it for a minute. Her eyes slowly closed and she sighed a peaceful, happy sigh. Yes, when I close my eyes I can still see her, hear her, but each day her voice fades and the memory fades. It's why I am glad I have that picture of her, or I'm afraid I would have forgotten what she looked like, Sen said honestly. Amir looked where the picture hung on the wall. He squeezed her shoulders and she looked back at her father's face. Sometimes, he whispered, never mind, tell me, do you really like that Tekka? He asked, and she saw that he flinched when he said Tekka. His name is Bard, Dad, and yes I do, she finally answered. Even after all that the Tekka have done to us? He asked, pained. Dad, just like every one of us is different, each Tekka is too, she said, looking up at him. Besides, the ones who took Mother are long gone. You saw to that, she pointed out softly. Amir sighed and looked around the room before his eyes drifted back to her. Even if time had passed, it still hurt remembering what happened to the forest and his family those many decades ago. I don't trust him, Sen, and I don't want to lose you. A touch of emotion filled his voice as he spoke. Sen was taken aback by her father's last statement. He was not known for showing his emotions, and she could tell that his concern for Bard wasn't just due to his hatred for the Tekka, but also for concern for her. She threw her arms around her dad and buried her face in his chest. Sen's heart ached for her father's understanding, her embrace a silent plea for trust. She felt him stiffen at her embrace, but after a second, he relaxed and she felt him place his arm around her. "You're not going to lose me, Dad," Sen muttered. "I don't expect you to trust him yet. You don't know him, but you know me." Sen lifted her head to look her father in the eyes. "Trust me, I didn't make this decision lightly." Amir started to say something but Sen cut him off. "All I'm asking is that you give him a chance. Will you do that for me?" Amir's silence stretched, each second heavy with decision. It was long enough that she worried what his answer would be. Without saying anything, he rose from the seat beside her and walked to the door. Silently she watched his back retreat in a cold manner. She pleaded in her heart that he would listen to her, if not her, then to reason. She knew Bard was not like the others and she felt safe with him. He paused at her door. "All right," Amir finally said. "I don't like this, but I will grant you your wish." Without turning he added, "But I also must be conscious of the safety of our people. So he will remain in confinement while he is here. Is that understood?" "Why, yes, father," Sen said. It was hard to contain her joy that Bard would be spared. But she tried to keep her voice steady, without emotion in case her father changed his mind. "In accordance with our laws, those who are pledged to a child of the woods must be judged by the elder tree. The trial will take place in 3 days, Amir said, and then turned to face his daughter. "I wouldn't get your hopes up, Sen. War Tree hates the Tekka even more than I do." Then he turned and left the room. Sen sat back in relief. She looked at the picture of her mother and sighed. She was not the same as her mother, a capable leader, and her father and grandfather had stepped up and taken care of things since she was still so young. But she wished they would allow her to take her place and trust her a bit more. She understood their worries, and she certainly hadn't taken steps to curtail their view of her naivety, partially because she did fear being in charge, and being naive was fun sometimes. If only she had known she would meet Bard and that he would run into the others, she might have been more authoritative before this. Then her mind began to wander in cycles. If she was in charge, she likely couldn't have snuck out and found him, and she might not know enough to convince the others to let him live. It was a hard balance trying to have freedom but also having authority. She hummed a tune to calm herself, and the tree swayed gently like it had when her mother had been here. Her anxiousness eventually swayed into calm and she smiled. Bard would surprise them all. Perhaps this is what her mother had wanted when she said to find a way to make peace with the Tekka. Chapter 6, Trial. Bard twitched as his friend's pacing began anew. He waited, hoping for Kai to stop on his own, but sighed in defeat when Kai began pawing at his cell floor. Bard rose from his comfortable spot in his own cell and looked over at Kai. "Enough, Kai. It'll be all right," Bard said, gaining the attention of the wolf-like mount. Kai raised one of his eyebrows in effect, saying, "How is this okay? Just be patient, my friend. Whatever Sen did seems to have pacified them for now, and I'm content for the moment to trust her," Bard said. Kai humphed and then turned and plopped down in defeat. It was the morning following Elwood's interview, and the incident which had Sen stop her father from killing Bard. After Elwood had given Bard Father Tree's token, no one had come to see him since. Bard stayed looking out his cell. The early morning light was shining through the leaves that were starting to turn, and he knew autumn would soon be here. The scene looked peaceful, if it wasn't for the uncertainty of his situation and the discordant harmony of the forest. It would have been a rather pleasant place to find oneself being held captive in. He chuckled to himself. "I bet you weren't expecting me to end up in a place like this." "Her father," he mumbled to himself, placing the token charm to his lips. Inwardly he was grateful that he had managed to regain Father Tree's token, despite the very uncompromising dryads, who insisted he relinquish his belongings. almost down to the skin of his back. Just thinking about it made his skin crawl and an involuntary sigh escaped his lips. At least one dryad seemed kind. He looked up at the tree which formed his cell. "Just what happened to the forest?" he asked, looking at the tree. He didn't have much time to think about it as a low growl from Kai indicated that someone was coming. Bard quickly tucked Father Tree's token in his shirt, and walked over to the edge of his cell to see who was coming. A small group of dryads approached him, led by Amir, who was followed by Elwood and a small procession of guards. Bard tried to read their expressions, to judge what their intent might be, but they each had a well-kept mask of neutrality, although there seemed an air of formality in the way they moved. They stopped about 10 feet away from his cell, and Amir began to sing a command to the tree holding him. The bars of Bard's cell lifted and Amir called out, "Tekka Bard, step forward." He used my name. That's a good sign, Bard thought to himself as he stepped a few feet out of the cells, and gave a bow to Amir. It was hard to tell what he was supposed to do, but Father Tree had always taught him to act in respect no matter what situation he found himself. As he raised his head back up to notice a small, almost imperceptible nod of Elwood's head, and guessed he had made the right choice, Amir took a step forward and said, "In accordance with our laws, any who have been pledged to a child of the woods must stand to be judged by the elder tree of the forest. Your trial will be in 3 days' time." Amir took on a more serious tone as he continued, "Elwood has informed me that you are not much of a fighter, so I would recommend you make the most of those 3 days. War Tree is not an easy opponent. We will provide you with a weapon of your choice and a sparring partner to practice with." As he spoke, a couple of guards walked forward carrying a large rolled-up cloth, and they placed it in front of Bard. As they started to unroll it, Bard saw that it contained a large array of weapons, swords, axes, bows, javelins, you name it, and it was there. Bard stared in shock at the large array of weaponry. "What kind of trial is this?" Bard asked, a little bewildered. Elwood looked sympathetically at Bard and asked, "Did Sen not tell the process that was involved with the pledge?" The truth was Bard didn't know a thing about this pledge and certainly nothing about a trial. However, this was the only thing that seemed to be keeping him alive, so he couldn't say that. "Well, I think she may have left out a few details," Bard finally admitted. Amir took a deep sigh, and muttered just loud enough for Bard to hear, "It's bad enough that she jumps into things without thinking about it, and now she's having this boy jump into something this serious without telling him what he's getting into." He then turned to face Elwood. "Father, fill the Tekka in on the details." Elwood walked over to Bard, and asked in the human tongue, "Did Sen tell you anything about this trial?" "No, I'm afraid not," Bard said. Elwood turned to Amir. "This is going to take a minute, Amir," he called out in a sternum. "Just get on with it," Amir said with obvious frustration. Elwood started to walk a short distance away from the group and gestured for Bard to follow. Once they were far enough to afford them a small degree of privacy, Elwood turned to Bard. "Listen carefully, Bard. Before anyone can marry a child of the wood," Elwood began, but Bard cut him off. "Marry? Wait, is that what a pledge is?" His outburst was a little louder than he intended, and several of the guards looked in his direction. "Keep your voice down," Elwood reprimanded him. "Sen clearly didn't tell you much, but I don't have time to explain it all now." "Oh, sorry," Bard said. Elwood continued, "Before anyone can marry a child of the wood, they must first be proven worthy be called a child of the wood, and only the elder tree can make that judgment." Elwood looked at Bard, who nodded that he understood. Elwood continued, "War Tree values one's abilities as a warrior above all else, so your trial will be one of combat and you will be facing War Tree." Bard thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Wait, that doesn't sound right. Every elder tree I have met has hated all of this fighting. Why would War Tree value it so much?" Elwood took a long breath before he spoke. "It didn't used to be that way, but this war has been long and this forest has lost more than most because of it." Elwood's gaze seemed distant, as if remembering some distant past. Elwood shook his head as if to shake off those thoughts. "We have all been affected by this war, including the elder tree. In fact, War Tree isn't his original name, but it is what he wants to be known by now," Elwood said. "Are you done yet?" Amir called over. "Almost," Elwood shouted over his shoulder. Bard saw Amir throw his hands in the air, obviously getting impatient. Elwood put a hand on Bard's shoulder and looked him in the eye. "Bard, look at me. War Tree hates the Tekka. If you were a dryad he would just be trying to test your skill, but you're not. He won't be holding back and you will be fighting for your life. Do you understand? Bard merely nodded. Good, then let's head back before my son loses his temper. They started walking back. As they did, Elwood said, you will only be allowed one weapon, so choose wisely. And then he walked back over to stand next to Amir. About time, Amir muttered, as his father joined him. He then turned to Bard. All right Tekka, you may choose your weapon. But know that you will only be allowed to have it when you are practicing. You will be given time each day to train starting an hour after sunrise, at which point a guard will come and get you and bring you to the training grounds. And you will be led back to your cell once your training is complete each day. Amir paused, his expression becoming more serious. Be aware Tekka, I do not trust you. I will ensure the safety of my people, and if you so much as point a weapon at any of them or make a false move, I will not hesitate to kill you, he warned. Bard had the suspicious feeling that this dryad would be watching him closely. I understand, Bard said with a simple bow. I have no intention of harming any of your people. Amir's eyes furrowed as he studied Bard intently. Now choose, he said suddenly and indicated with a slight nod to the weapons on the ground. Bard noticed out the corner of his eye the slight shifting of the guards as they watched with great interest in his actions. He had a slight inclination that they were curious about his choice, since it was rare for any of them to see the thought process of a Tekka in choosing a weapon. Bard began to stroll next to the carefully laid out weapons. He noted long shafted weapons, shiny blades of long length, short length, and even some that reminded him of kitchen knives, but more sleek and meant for killing. He mentally shook his head. His eyes roamed over coils of ropes, some with 3 orbs attached to one end. The others had assortments of stones or nasty flesh-biting metal embedded into them. Again he internally sighed and shook his head. He had no idea what any of these were, let alone how to use them. Certainly he had seen a few in some encounters with the humans and the dryads, but he was at a loss of how to address the developing situation. He was no warrior. Think Bard, he said to himself. What's the point here? I'm here to prove my worth to this elder tree. Even if I was forced into this situation, it seems I have to play along if I am to live, he sighed. All these were meant to impress an elder. I am certain all the elders are tired of the wars, so why fight? He knelt down near some small items. Looking over them, he could feel the intensity of the stares from the dryad guards, and if he was honest, the leader and Elwood as well. Finally he shook his head. I'll die if I use these. My best bet is to go with what I know. I'm sorry, but can someone bring me something else? Bard said at last. Amir was surprised, same as his guards. Elwood cocked his head to the side, as if curious. These are all the types we have, Bard. We've accumulated these since the wars began, from both sides, Elwood said, breaking the unfolding silence. Bard remained silent and eventually Elwood sighed. What is it you require? Actually, it's something from my personal belongings, Bard said, leaning back comfortably in a manner that spoke of his acceptance to his solution. A weapon, Elwood said, hiding his surprise, as he cast a side glance to Amir. He had personally seen all the items. There hadn't been a weapon among them, unless he was wrong. Was there something he had overlooked? It would make sense. He decided that Bard would have some defenses for his journeys. But what was it? You could say it's a weapon of sorts, Bard replied. And what does this weapon look like? Elwood asked. It's stored in a case of this shape, Bard said as he stooped down and began drawing the outline of the fiddle case. Amir and Elwood shared a glance before Elwood asked, one of the relics. A look of worry and concern crossed over Amir's face. I don't know, he began, and Elwood knew he was imagining the worst outcome. We did say he could use a weapon of his choice, Elwood prompted. Amir stiffened. Ordinarily he wouldn't have an issue with this. Except this was a pledge for his daughter, with a Tekka, without his consent. Mainly it was because there was a Tekka in his woods. But there was also a sense of protection that fathers get for their daughters, that made it more difficult. Of course, it was also a pledge, something of great significance, and a task not to be brushed aside. Despite his personal reservations and judgments, he would have to keep to his word, the word of countless generations of dryads and decorum. How he wished he could run the Tekka through and be over this. But he had promised his daughter to give the Tekka a chance. So be it, Amir said and turned to one of the guards. "Go retrieve the weapon, then meet us at the training grounds," Amir ordered. The guard brought his finger to his chin and bowed his head in the same manner that Bard had seen a few days earlier. Before turning and running off into the forest, Amir watched the guard go before turning back to Bard. "All right, Tekka, follow me. It's time you meet your sparring partner." A smile broke across Amir's lips as he said this. Bard didn't know who this sparring partner would be, but the smile on Amir's lips held an obvious amusement that Bard was not sure he liked. Chapter 7, Sparring Tree. Bard heard the training grounds before he saw them. The creaking of wood and the shouts of dryads filled his ears. As they got closer, Bard could see that the training grounds was a large opening in the middle of the forest. The trees surrounding the clearing had their branches woven into a platform overlooking the training grounds. Bard noted that there were rows of chairs and he could see many dryads sitting in them, observing the training in the grounds. Several other dryads were engaging one another in one-on-one combat. But what really caught Bard's eye was a large tree in the middle of the field that was attacking another dryad. The tree's massive branches swung in large arches at the dryad, who seemed to dodge the attacks with ease. Bard was too far away to tell, but there was something about the way this dryad moved that seemed familiar. As they got closer to the edge of the clearing, Bard's eyes widened in surprise. "Wait," Bard exclaimed. There was no mistaking it now. The dryad fighting the large tree was in fact Sen. Bard watched mesmerized by the scene in front of him. Sen's ability to duck and dodge the constant attacks from the large tree, as well as find time in between attacks to fire an arrow from her bow. Each arrow seemed to find its mark with a resounding thunk, as the arrows embedded itself in a target on the tree. "Quite impressive, isn't she?" Bard turned and was surprised to see that it was Amir who had spoken. He didn't look at Bard but rather kept his eyes riveted on Sen. "We've been at war with your kind for a long time, Tekka. We've learned that if our children are to survive, they must be trained to be a warrior from a very young age." Bard looked back at Sen and marveled at her capability, but also at the fact that he was still alive, despite the obvious fact that she could have easily killed him without him being aware. "Clearly I didn't account for her curiosity when she was trained," Amir stated, bringing back Bard's attention. Bard thought on it for a second, and realized they both had a similar train of thought. He surmised it would be best to either feign ignorance, or stay silent, as he currently stood in enemy territory. With a particular dryad wanting him dead, he opted for silence. Amir looked between his daughter and the Tekka standing next to him. Sometimes, he could admire the wisdom of this enemy, and other times, he wanted to slay him. Due to the pledge, he was constantly finding himself taking more time to humanize the enemy, and that could become fatal later, but at the same time, this Tekka could become part of his family. He pushed the thoughts aside. For now, he would enjoy watching Bard train. The noise of the tree ceased and Sen danced lightly to a stop. She smiled and twirled around before bowing to the tree. As she skipped out, she paused in her step for a brief second as she saw Bard standing next to Amir. A bright smile lit her face and she nearly ran over, but was stopped by a hand that came in front of her. Bard's gaze followed to the owner of the obstruction, and saw a scarred and aged dryad. Like most of the dryads of this forest, his hair seemed alive, green in color with the roots changing to a deep red tone. He walked a few steps back the way Sen had come from, and reached her place, grabbing her shoulder in a friendly, but firm manner. He spoke in her ear, which at this distance, was indistinguishable from the commotion still going on about them. He pointed towards the tree she had been sparring with, and she sighed before going back with him. "Sir, the weapon the Tekka asked for," a dryad said, bowing to Amir and holding out the case which housed the fiddle. Bard waited, but relief filled his heart as he saw the familiar case. Amir nodded, and saw Bard's glance toward him. Taking the case, Amir turned to Bard. "Remember, you so much as breathe the wrong way and I will slay you, pledge or not," Amir warned. "I'll keep that in mind," Bard responded, as Amir handed him the case. Bard set the case on the ground and opened it to check on the instrument's condition. He wasn't sure how his gear had been handled since his capture. Bard picked up the fiddle and turned it over, looking at the various sides. Luckily, no damage could be spotted. Much to his relief, Bard knew how to repair it if there had been light damage, but that would have taken several days and he didn't have that much time. Elwood watched with keen interest as Bard handled the relic. He wasn't the only one as he noticed Amir shift a little as Bard plucked at the strings, producing a slightly discordant sound, a bit off-key. Bard muttered to himself as he started twisting small knobs on the end of the relic. Again Bard strummed the strings, this time producing a harmonized chord. The sound was pleasant to hear, albeit different from dryadic singing. Bard smiled as he placed the instrument back in its case and closed it. "You mentioned a sparring partner," Bard said as he stood and looked toward Amir and Elwood. "Indeed, and it looks like he's just about ready for you," Amir said as he looked out into the grounds. "Come, it's about time we introduced you," Amir said, a small smile crossing his lips. Elwood could tell that his son was a bit eager as he turned and led the group out onto the grounds. As they walked out, Elwood could see that many of the seats on the viewing platforms were full with dryads of all ages, coming to see this spectacle. Despite his son's best efforts, word had gotten around about this strange techer. Amir had done well to keep word of the boy's intrusion into the woods quiet. However, once the pledge had been made and the trial set, there was no keeping it quiet. According to tradition, no trial was held in secret, because if challengers succeeded they would be named a child of the forest. Naturally, word of a techer attempting such a trial made many curious, especially the children, many of whom this would be their first time seeing a techer. The group followed Amir, as he led them over to where Sen and the scarred dryad stood talking beside the battle tree. They both looked up as the group approached, Sen with a cheerful grin and the older dryad with an obvious scowl. "Keith, this is the techer I mentioned earlier," Amir said, gesturing to Bard. "Bard, this is Keith, one of our strongest warriors and the steward of these ground. It is his responsibility to train our people to fight," Elwood said. Bard bowed his head slightly in response. Keith frowned. "Yes, I teach them how to fight, but a techer will not be able to survive. You might as well quit and forfeit your life," Keith remarked. "HMPH, Uncle Keith. He is more surprising than you know," Sen responded. "Is that so? Well then, we shall see," Keith said with obvious skepticism in his voice. Bard got the impression that Keith was not happy about this whole affair, whether that was because of the pledge with his niece, or just that fact that Bard was a techer. Bard wasn't sure, but he expected that it was a combination of both. Keith looked Bard up and down as if sizing him up. He raised an eyebrow as he looked at the case in Bard's hand. "Your weapon?" Keith asked, pointing to the case. Bard sighed. "It's not a weapon," he mumbled to himself, in human tongue. "Of sorts," he replied to Keith, still baffled by the perplexity of the situation he found himself in. "Are you to be my sparring partner?" Keith laughed. "Oh no, I'm just here to make sure you live long enough to face the trial," he said with amusement in his words. Bard noted the almost imperceptible smile cross Amir's face at these words. In all honesty, he felt very confused. Then, Bard looked around. Keith's eyes shifted to the battle tree that Sen had been sparring with. As Bard's gaze followed, the tree suddenly shifted, closing the distance between it and the group. Bard was shocked. He quickly glanced around searching for a voice, but none of the dryads were singing. Keith and Amir smirked. As Bard looked about, Elwood stepped forward. "Not all trees need our song to move," Elwood spoke in the human tongue. "I've only ever seen elder trees move on their own before." "So why is this one?" Bard asked Elwood in human. "This tree is old, Bard. Even I'm not sure how old it is. It was one of the very first battle trees and has endured centuries of war. Now we use it to train our warriors. We call it sparring tree," Elwood explained. Bard took in the information as he looked at the tree before him. The trees in Father Tree's forest were old, and yet none of them could move without Father's command. So age must not be the only factor, but years of experience on the battlefield must have changed this tree. Bard mused to himself. "So, sparring tree is my sparring partner then?" Bard asked. "That's correct," Elwood said. Bard was about to ask another question when he was cut off. "You two done yet?" Keith suddenly said. Elwood sighed and gave a small nod to Keith. "Sorry," he muttered in passing. "Come, Father. Sen, let's leave the techer to Keith," Amir said with obvious amusement in his voice. As he turned to leave, "He's having way too much fun with this," Bard thought. Keith opened his mouth and began to sing. Bard watched as his sparring partner began to respond and moved to Keith's words. "May I ask a question?" Bard said, turning to Keith. Keith stopped singing and seemed to be listening, waiting. Encouraged, Bard continued. I have seen that tree move on its own, so why do you still sing to it?" he asked. Over sparing tree's centuries of fighting, it has become a very capable fighter. However, it sometimes has a hard time holding back, so I sing to moderate it when it is fighting a paused and looked Bard over less capable opponent. Keith finished with contempt. "Well, I suppose that makes sense," Bard said, ignoring the obvious scrutiny. It was nothing new to him after all. "In your case there is another reason," Keith said, as if an afterthought. "Oh, and what is that?" Bard asked. "You're a techer," Keith flatly stated. "Right," Bard muttered. "If Sparring Tree has been fighting my kind for so long, I imagine it would be hard not to see me as an enemy that must be destroyed," Bard thought, putting the pieces together. "And I can't let you die until you face War Tree." Keith sighed. Bard thought for a moment before speaking. "I'd like to make a request." Keith raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Bard took that as permission to continue. "I appreciate you making sure I don't die and all, but other than stopping Sparring Tree from killing me, please refrain from moderating or controlling his actions." Keith stiffened and looked at Bard in shock, his mouth beginning to move. "The way I see it," Bard said quickly before Keith could refute him, "War Tree isn't going to hold back on me, so why should Sparring Tree?" Bard's words surpassed Keith. He assumed the request would be to go easy on him. Just a glance at this young techer, and Keith knew he was no fighter. And yet he had to admit the kid had guts. Maybe that is what his niece saw in him. "Very well, I will only intervene if absolutely necessary. When you are ready you may begin. I will tell Sparring Tree to let you have the first move." Keith said at length. With that he briefly sung to Sparring Tree, then stepped back. Excitement on the observation platform grew as Bard approached Sparring Tree. All the dryads were interested in what would happen. "Wait, why isn't Keith singing?" Sen asked, turning to look at her father, a little distressed. "Keith has been given orders to moderate Sparring Tree. The only reason he would not do so is if the techer asked him not to," Amir responded, feeling a little surprised. "But father, even I can't fight him without Uncle's help," Sen whined with obvious concern. Elwood placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Fear not. Uncle Keith has been ordered to keep Bard alive until he faces War Tree," Elwood calmly stated. "But," Sen began, but Amir cut her off. "This is the techer's choice. Now let's see how he does," he said, gruffly, as he watched the young boy approach the tree. A hushed silence fell over the grounds as Bard stood before Sparring Tree. "Well, time to see if this works," Bard said to himself as he placed his fiddle case on the ground next to him. At the same time he placed Father Tree's token in his hand as he stood back up. "Greetings, Sparring Tree," Bard said as he twirled his hand holding the token, letting out a brief note as air passed around the token. He then let his hand come down to front of him as he bowed towards the tree. He hoped that his movement would simply be seen as an elaborate bow by the dryads, but now to see how the tree responded. Sparring Tree seemed to shiver for a moment at the sound of the token, and stood still for several seconds before the top branches shifted forward, returning the bow to Bard. A collective gasp was heard throughout the grounds. Amir shot to his feet. "What is going on?" he said in unbelief. He had never seen such a thing before. He looked at those around him. His daughter was beaming, which annoyed him, and Elwood seemed just as shocked and was muttering to himself, probably trying to figure out just what had happened. Amir, not finding any answers here, looked down at Keith and found him returning his gaze. Keith could see the question in Amir's face but merely shrugged. He had no idea why Sparring Tree would return a bow to this techer or anyone else for that matter. He had worked with this tree for a long time, and he had never seen the tree bow. The more he watched this techer, the more his interest was piqued. After several seconds, Bard rose from his bow and the tree did likewise. "Oh good," Bard said in relief, looking at the tree. "Now the real work begins," he said as he sat down and closed his eyes. The observers watched with keen interest, but Bard didn't move again, and neither did Sparring Tree. It was as if he was in meditation. Sen watched, Amir noted, with a satisfied smile. She knew something. Chapter 8, Disturbance and Discordance. Bard listened to the music and internally began to imagine playing the notes that would harmonize to the song of the forest. The more he listened, the more he recognized that the song was incomplete, missing a vital yet unnoticeable part. He began to wonder if this was the part often sung by the elder tree in the past before he became a war tree. He wouldn't know until he approached War Tree, and he would only get one time to try this. He hoped he got the song right, and could change the War Tree from this bloody, unfulfilling path. He knew full well that his life was on the line. As he sat there, meditating, he began to process what had happened to him in the past few days, between encountering the dryads of this forest, meeting Sen's family, and having her thrust a marriage to her on him, no doubt to save his life. He felt overwhelmed to say the least. That and learning that the elder tree had changed into some war tree, and his song was strangely missing from the forest. Was there more to this? Some hidden force at play? Hardly. He surmised that the dryads would have stopped anything like that from happening, unless they were involved. He inwardly sighed. If being pledged was that serious of a deal that they wouldn't kill him, but await the judgment of the elder tree, he wasn't sure what it all entailed, but it would be far more than what humans called an engagement. Sen seemed smart, but naive. He wondered if he would really be required to marry her. Would the dryads honor the elder tree's decision? If it was his death, oh yes, without a doubt, but to be allowed to marry Sen, he supposed he would have to face this life event eventually, but this was a bit too absurd. To be fair, he did find her cute, and he had no idea if he refused the pledge if that would mean his death, or perhaps hunted vigorously by the dryads of this forest. That would be a pain. However, she seemed a bit young, perhaps a bit immature sometimes, and with the long lifespan of dryads, he would die whilst she lived on. The more he thought about it, the more his head hurt. In any case, he would have to ask her and perhaps her grandpa what all this entailed. Thankfully most if not every other dryad didn't know human tongue. He knew that Sen's vocabulary was limited, so it was quite possible she wouldn't be able to explain what he needed to know. That narrowed it down to just her grandfather. He sighed and banished the thoughts, focusing on the song and feeling grateful that he had learned to join the songs of other forests, to commune with their elders. However, he felt inadequate in this situation. Not only was a vital part missing, he was having to come up with it. He knew that he could change the song, direct it with this part, and hence, he was worried he might not find the right part that the elder sang, and instead come up with his own. The weight of this realization was heavy, to say the least. Bard took a deep breath, trying to calm his emotions. For now he needed to focus on the task at hand. With that he tucked away those thoughts and emptied his mind and listened. Gradually his mind faded into the music. Bard wasn't sure how long he had been there when he heard footsteps coming towards him. He opened his eyes and noted that the shadows were lengthening, and that the temperature had begun to drop, indicating that evening was fast approaching. Bard turned toward the footsteps and saw Keith approaching him. "Time's up for today, Tekka," he said as he came up to him. Bard nodded his head to him and then stood and bowed towards Sparring Tree. "Thank you, friend," he said as the tree returned the bow. Another dryad approached and held out his hands to Bard. Bard looked at Keith, who glanced at his weapon. He realized what was implied and handed the fiddle to the dryad, who flinched, letting out an uneasy breath. Before leaving with the instrument, Bard looked around and realized that there were far fewer spectators than before. "I suppose I'm not that entertaining," he muttered to himself. He was led back to his quarters where a delighted Kai anxiously awaited him. Not even a few steps into the cage, and the oversized wolf pounced on him, licking his face happily. Yes, I get it. I'm glad to see you too, buddy. Now move over, you weigh a ton," he growled out the last part. Kai stepped off, but not before pouting. "I can't help these accommodations, and I certainly do not think they would allow you to come with me, and frankly it's not that much more exciting. I can promise you that." Kai sighed, looking defeated, then gave him a furtive glance. "No, look, I'll ask, but don't expect much." Bard sighed. The very next day he noticed the curious dryads almost avoiding and fleeing from around him. No doubt, the large wolf walking a few paces behind him didn't help. There also seemed to be an increase in guards as they walked, and Bard sighed. This was certainly more unwanted attention. Perhaps the golden-haired relatives of Sen had agreed, just to see his reaction, see how he would behave if he had less strings attached. Or perhaps because yesterday was so boring that it would be an amusing spectacle. There was also the strange influence that Sen had over her family, and he didn't want to think about the eventuality of what this whole ordeal entailed. Marriage. He stilled his hands. He wanted to pull at his hair and vent his frustrations out loud, but he didn't need the sort of attention that might bring. At least the elder dryad, Sen's grandfather, seemed aware of the situation and his unknowing stumble into this. They came to the training grounds where Sen was once again finishing her training. She seemed delighted to see Kai, and ran over and past Bard as she embraced the oversized creature. Bard sighed. "Hello, Sen," he said, and she snickered as she nuzzled into Kai's fur. Then with equal excitement she looked at Bard. "Hi Bard. They let him out?" she asked, and Bard chuckled. It was an obvious question, one that he didn't need to answer, though he was just a bit jealous. She seemed way more favorable of Kai than to him. He seriously wanted to question if she had made the pledge just so she could be around Kai more, or if she really liked him. As if sensing his thoughts, she turned and grabbed his hand and smiled. "Bard, I'll be back at lunch," she said, and Bard looked at her a bit surprised as she skipped off. What was that about? His gaze lingered on her before noticing Amir fuming. "I should try to not aggravate him more," he thought as he received the case with his fiddle. He sighed. Sen seemed perfectly capable of making him her father's enemy without him assisting. At the very least he should avoid adding fuel to the fire. That was her dad's frustration and resentment. Bard looked at Sparring Tree and Keith as they waited for him to approach. He bowed to the tree as Keith stepped back, and Sparring Tree quickly bowed back. Bard sat down and opened his fiddle. He had an idea of how he would handle this, and last time, Sparring Tree was more than a little helpful. He hoped to get similar results today. The hours began to pass and Bard felt a bit tired. This level of concentration and continual formulation was beginning to tax his mind. He looked away at Kai, whose head perked up. He motioned for the wolf to keep relaxing in the shadows. Then he noticed a bird fly in. Bard's eyes watched it fly over before circling around Sparring Tree and landing on one of its branches. It let out a few chirps before flying away. Bard wouldn't have thought more about it till he looked around at the others. The dryads, who seemed the most trained and experienced, were whispering, or looking like they had just been slapped in the face. Was that little bird a big deal? "Where is Keith?" he mused as his eyes scanned. Then he saw the dryad leaning against another tree. His expression was full of so many emotions that it was hard to understand what was going on with him. Bard took a deep breath and listened again. Then he paused and looked up at Sparring Tree. Keith was about to step in, till he noticed the Tekka rise to his feet, looking confused and shocked. Keith's brows furrowed. Has the Tekka noticed it as well? How is that possible? In all Keith's years fighting, not a single Tekka had reacted to something like this. He looked to Amira and noted the small nod. He smirked as he kept in the shadows. So this wasn't some fuss after all. The Tekka had some guts. Keith's interest was growing. Perhaps this is what had first gotten Sen to let the Tekka live instead of killing him on sight. If so, he would need to talk to his niece after all. Chapter 9, A Complete Melody. Bard could hardly keep still. He gripped his token from Father Tree and began to approach Sparring Tree. "Your song?" he said, and the tree shivered. "Why?" he asked. Bard recalled his mission and placed Father Tree's token to his lips. He then held it out and watched as the tree moved on its own towards him. The other dryads started to move as if surprised. Bard bit his lip. He wanted a bit more time before having to resort to the next stage. But he had delayed this as long as possible. He wanted to curse the bird. It had started all of this, but it was too late now. Kneeling down, Bard placed the token on the ground and sat back. Sparring Tree walked forward and its branches moved till one of them touched the token. As the tree placed its branch on the token, Bard strummed a single note on the fiddle. This position wasn't ideal at all and the note was a bit off-key. Despite his inward squelch at the sound, Sparring Tree stilled. Unfazed by the sudden stillness, Bard reached for the token. Branches parted and he grabbed the token before putting it around his neck. "I'm sure every dryad is going to try to kill me after this," he thought as he let out a deep sigh. It was a bit late to try to stop now. He pulled out the fiddle from the case, and strummed a few of the notes before tuning it. He grabbed the bow and placed it across the bridge before taking a deep breath. He then finalized the formulation in his head and pulled the bow across the strings. A harmonious sound played out and he began to add the melody to the soundscape. Sparring Tree shifted in front of him and Kai walked over and sat near him. The bird from earlier took off and flitted about him before heading higher into the sky. As he continued to play, He noticed the interest from the other dryads. He steadied his hand and tried to ignore their words and confusion as he played on. Finally the song began to reach the end and he looked at Sparring Tree. This would be the finale. Would he get the reaction he was looking for? Please, Bard thought as he pulled the last note out of the fiddle. He stood there for a moment and watched the tree quiver. Then it stepped back and Bard slumped. Not quite the reaction I was hoping for, he thought as he sighed. His hand with the bow was at his chin, as he began to contemplate what he had missed. Was the tune too complex? Or perhaps it was too fast? What if that's not the melody, but it should be close? Sparring Tree did shiver, so I'm closer than I had anticipated. Though it would have been nice if I had gotten it right the first time. Bard groaned as he set the fiddle down and looked at his faithful companion. Kai came over and nuzzled into his hand and Bard pushed back. It wasn't good to be holding a relic while Kai wanted attention. He placed the fiddle back in its case and then rubbed Kai's furry head. The humming of the dog let him know that Kai liked it very much. And then the wolf looked between the fiddle and the tree. If only I could hear your voice. I'm sure you could pick out what I missed, he said to Kai, who hummed as if he was sorry. I know. You would help if you could. I appreciate it. He scratched behind Kai's ear and the wolf groaned as it placed his head down. The closed eyes and calm demeanor spoke about Kai's pleasure at being scratched there. Bard let a simple smile grace his face. He was disappointed, but he still had some time to figure this out. Kai would always be there for him, just like he had back in Father Tree's forest. Thinking of the place brought out a sad sigh. He missed the old tree who had raised him. He missed the safety and protection afforded in Father's forest, and he missed the wise words of comfort. Best not to dwell on such thoughts, he thought as he stretched and rolled his neck. He noticed the dryads approaching him and he quietly awaited for them, rising gently to stand and look at their eyes. The three guards approached and bowed before him in that respectful manner, catching him off guard. His eyes looked from one to the next until one rose and looked him hard in the eyes. The elder wants to talk with you, this dryad said calmly. Bard nodded and looked to Kai, who was observing why his scratches had stopped. Bard patted the large wolf on the head before stepping towards the dryad. Led the way, he said back as he closed his eyes with a slight bow. When he looked back at the eyes of the guard, they were still filled with suspicion, but also some acknowledgement. The guards turned about and filed out around him as he was guided to the elder. The horns of Sen's grandfather were easy to spot, but it wasn't until he took a turn around one of the older trees that he was able to see them. Bard acknowledged the old dryad, who smiled warmly and excused the guards. I'm sorry for taking you away from your practice, but there is something I needed to talk to you about. It's no problem. I've hit a wall, so it's nice to have a break, Bard answered as the dryad motioned for him to sit across from him. Hit a wall? Such a human way to express that, Elwood chuckled. Really? Indeed, we would say something like, in a tree without a voice. Or that is the closest in human terms I could describe it as. In lingo sign voci? Bard asked in a sternum. Elwood's eyes grew wide and then he laughed a hearty laugh. No, it's actually sign in arboreum canticum. He wiped a bit of mirth from his eyes as they settled on Bard. Though that was quite a good guess. Bard listened to the elder sigh in delight at the exchange before speaking up. Pardon me, but I don't think you called me over to talk over the differences of our language. Indeed not. Sen will be here soon for lunch and asks that I chat with you beforehand. Sen suggested this. Bard asked. Of course she did. Tekka. There is much for you to learn, and unfortunately not a lot of time to learn it. Bard let out his breath with a slight groan. He knew this was true, but he also needed to get the elder tree's approval. Couldn't this wait till after? He wondered. He tried to be as relaxed as he could in this situation, but the waiting part was what bothered him. Couldn't Sen have called me over when she got here? Bard, you've heard the elder tree goes by the name War Tree, Elwood said as if sensing Bard's train of thought. War Tree? Why go by such a gruesome name? I thought. SHHH. Elwood hushed. He looked around then sighed. Be careful where you voice such thoughts. You certainly are experienced with the other woods and their elder trees, but loss still affects the trees just as much as it does us. Elwood sighed and leaned back. That's as much as a hint as I dare give you, so if possible, let's turn our attention to your pledge. Bard bit his lip and Elwood's smile was one of patient understanding. In our eyes, you are so young. Though I assume the way you carry yourself you are quite mature for your age," Elwood said as if appraising him. "I wouldn't know," Bard said as he clenched his fist. "I don't get along with the humans, so I have nothing to gauge your assessment against. A human shunned by his own. No wonder Sen took an interest in you," Elwood said. Bard stared past the dryad as memories flooded his mind. "I don't think it shunned as much as I terrify them." The hushed words escaped Bard's lips. "Sorry. It might have to do with your equipment, though I imagine your mount is also terrifying," Elwood assessed. Bard bristled. "Kai was more than a mount. Kai's my friend, not a mount," he said with a raised voice, and the dryad seemed surprised by his reaction. Bard sat back quickly, realizing what he had done. "Sorry, no, it was my mistake in choosing that word. You obviously have suffered from it." The dryad tapped his horn as he acknowledged his slip. "Though we've deviated from the original conversation, shall we return to it, please?" Bard said, surprised at how well the dryad was communicating with him. "Your pledge. Do you know what is required after you get War Tree's approval?" Elwood asked. Bard had a vague idea, but if there were details, then he had no clue what they were. Elwood sighed, as if disappointed and knowing at the same time. "Quadpooler," Elwood muttered, before Bard could think through it. The dryad looked at him with a firm resolve. "If you are accepted, there will be a celebration for the next week, though I imagine that many dryads will either avoid you while keeping their children away or curious about you, and approach you quite insistently. Despite my son's best effort, there is bound to be a few more like Sen who are very curious about you." Bard could only nod. He had some idea, but if he was truly accepted into the forest, it was anyone's guess how they would react. He certainly knew there were some who were hostile. Totems to disarrant," Elwood muttered, and Bard perked up at the dryadic word for father's token. "Who learns about the tokens?" Bard asked, and Elwood flinched. "Just muttering to myself. It's strange to think you know so much about our language." "Father taught me." "Your father, the elder tree I was raised by." "Oh, right. Well, that's also something that will need to be done." "What will?" Bard asked. "Bard, you will need to travel with Sen for a time and help her gather the tokens, or at least the approval of all the elders you have met so far. Normally this wouldn't be an issue, but..." He looked at Bard as the tucker sat back. He had gained many tokens, more than most dryads, and now he had to go get the permission of his pledge to Sen from each of them. "What else?" Bard asked as calmly as he could. "You'll need to get it done in 1 year." 1 year? Bard nearly jumped up. That would be impossible. It took him at least 2 to get his collection, and that was because Father Tree had assisted him in learning their songs. "How do I realistically do that? Why is this even a rule? Though, if you don't return in a year, I'm sure my son would hunt you down." "Why is that?" "Because it meant that you failed and you have either killed Sen or taken her, like a hostage." "What? Why would it mean that?" "It doesn't, but that is how he would take it." Elwood shrugged, and Bard wanted to slam his forehead against the table. "Why do they have such unreasonable expectations?" he groaned, and Elwood chuckled. It was a custom set with good intentions. A child of the forest should be paired with someone of nearly equal standing in the eyes of the elders, and should they be unable to accomplish that, then they aren't to be married to one another. Bard stiffened. "What did you say?" Elwood seemed confused, and then a knowing smile hit his eyes. "Which part are you confused about?" Elwood asked, and Bard looked about. There weren't any other dryads nearby. He was wondering when Sen would appear as he leaned closer to the elder. "Not getting married, that part," he said softly. Elwood closed his eyes as he sat back. Bard was sure he understood the implications of that question. "I'm sure Sen has already thought of that. She seems to like you, but this situation seems to be her way to protect you. Though, if you don't return, even the 2 of us won't be able to keep her father from hunting you down." Bard groaned. "I don't need more enemies, and I don't want to spend all my time hiding in father's woods. I'm sure the one who rescued me would be disappointed if that is what happened to my life." "Bard," a childish-sounding Sen said as she flung her arms around him and giggled. Bard avoided the bag of food she brought as it aimed for his head. "Hi Sen," he said calmly. "Glad for the distraction. Welcome. We've been waiting," Elwood said calmly. He seemed to be speaking more plainly now. Perhaps it was for Sen's benefit. Bard had a decent grasp of the Dryadic language, though it was without the culture. Sen would need to grasp the Tekka language now, especially if they were to be traveling together, though he doubted they could hide that lively hair of hers so she could blend in. "Well, food's ready," Sen said with an amused grin. She placed it out on the table and Bard reached for his tokens. He thought of Father Tree as Sen began to dish out the food. The portion she set in front of Bard looked more like his normal fare than what she placed before her grandfather. As she sat down with her own food, she grinned and Elwood regarded her kindly. For all intents and purposes, Sen's family really seemed to care about her. But where was her mother? He had never heard mention of her from either of the men in her life. He assumed the grandmother had passed away. But wouldn't it normally be up to the mother to discern if the man who wanted the daughter's hand was worth the effort? Sen and Elwood chatted peaceably, and eventually Bard returned to his training. Kai waited for him and eagerly greeted him before he attempted the next run on the song. His curiosity made it more difficult, though no less troublesome than when the bird had suddenly appeared. He wondered which elder tree had sent it. It was possible Father Tree had, but it was also possible War Tree had instigated Sparring Tree. There were enough reasons for either conclusion that he didn't seem to have a straightforward answer. He concluded the training, and was guided back to the tree, where Kai and him retired comfortably for the night. The next day they were woken roughly by the sounds of Dryadic voices outside. As they roused and looked around, the sounds died off with exclaims of being caught. Bard chuckled. Their curiosity was growing, and now they dared to peek in on him and Kai while they slept. Such a childlike thing to do, but also normal when you are worried of confronting someone while they are awake. He stretched and then heard the sounds of Sen giggling. He looked out and noticed she was the one bringing him his instrument today. "Good morning," Sen, Bard said with a final stretch as he rose. Kai's head looked over and then he too was up, and pushing past Bard with a very excited pant. He stopped short of the girl, and she began scratching his chin as she set the instrument case down. Kai's large tail was hard to get past as he wagged it back and forth, and thumped it as she changed scratching places. Bard sighed. "Kai, can you?" The wolf looked back and then stopped wagging his tail long enough for him to get through, and shortly resumed as Bard grabbed the case. "Morning, Bard. Sleep well?" Sen asked. "Yes. How about you? Did you sleep well?" he asked. She nodded, and then grinned a deep grin that made her eyes slit, as she scratched Kai with more vigor. "Good, Kai. You like these?" she said with a sing-song voice, and Bard let a chuckle escape off his teeth. Sen also laughed and Kai was soon laying on the floor in complete bliss. Bard spent a bit of time tuning the fiddle and checking the strings. When he was ready, Sen guided them to the arena where Keith and Sparring Tree were waiting for him. This time he pulled out his token and waited till the others gave them space. He greeted Sparring Tree and then let the token hang in the air. When he saw the tree quiver, he spun the token around and around, letting the droning sound begin. Sparring Tree trembled and began to move, and Bard walked to the side. This tree, if it was one of the oldest, it should have a song similar to War Tree, but it hardly sung it. He found this concerning as he worried War Tree had abandoned the origin song due to the fighting. If he could remind War Tree of the origin song, then perhaps he wouldn't need to fight. If not, he would likely die, and all this was happening tomorrow. He had listened to the entire woods on the first day, and the second he had listened to the influencing song. Now he needed the origin song. After a bit, he pulled the fiddle into position and began to play the song from yesterday. Sparring Tree stilled. Then a sound pierced Bard's ears. He stopped and looked back to see Elwood humming a tune. Sparring Tree also seemed unnaturally quiet. As Bard listened, he heard the song he had been gathering harmonize with this tune, and an idea struck him. He played a few notes with his fingers plucking strings, and then brought the bow up and began to play. He didn't try to replace the tune from Elwood, instead he harmonized with it. Elwood stopped and stared while Bard kept playing. The two stared each other down before Bard bowed and then looked at Sparring Tree. He sorted the notes and realized that this would be a most difficult piece. Some places he had two notes to play and his fingers barely could support the two strings that he could hit while playing those notes together. He could likely do this better with the guitar or some other instrument, but those were both bulky and he had left them with Father Tree for this journey. He thought through it, and then tentatively practiced the parts until his fingers were not against the movements. Then he brought the bow up and played the harder chords until he was satisfied, and added them into the complete version. Sparring Tree began to move and came very close before moving his branches around Bard, but never touching him. He finished the song quickly and then approached Sparring Tree and placed Father's token to its trunk. As he did so, he heard the song softly sung back to him from the tree and sat down and listened. A couple notes were different, but overall, he had managed to find the song. He would need to thank the elder dryad for his assistance before the day was over. Eventually he heard a dryadic voice command Sparring Tree to move, and Bard emerged from the branches unscathed, which seemed to surprise Keith and Sen, who were just outside. Sen jumped and wrapped her arms around him and buried her head into his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" she asked, and Bard returned the hug. "No, I'm fine," Bard said, and Sen leaned back and looked up into his eyes before glancing up and down to make sure. She sighed with relief and then leaned against Bard. "I was worried when Sparring Tree ate you," she said, and Bard laughed. The image of the tree wrapping around him probably did look similar to a metaphorical swallowing, and since he hadn't been worried about it, it made him appreciate her concern a bit differently. As he held Sen, his gaze lifted to look at Keith, who closed his eyes as he took in a breath of relief. "Paratus S?" Keith asked, and Bard nodded. He was ready to face the trial of War Tree. He looked down at Sen in his arms, and took a long breath before looking skyward, as he saw a few birds flitting about. He was as ready as he could be. Tonight he would practice the tune and the fingerings, and the rest would be judgment of the elder tree. Chapter 10, The Trial. Dawn rose and Bard was already alert and awake. He fingered the fiddle, grateful the dryads had let him practice overnight. As he made sure his instrument was tuned, he heard footsteps and looked back to see Sen as she slipped through the bars. "I wanted to see you before you go. Also, I wanted to bring these back to you," she said softly as she crept around the slumbering guy. Bard rose and held out his hand as she placed a string of tokens in his hands. He nearly cried as he held them again, the remaining tokens gifted to him by the other elder trees. He brought them to his chest and could smell their familiar scents. The honey wood, pine, and fresh earthen tones filled him with a sense of ease that he had been missing. "Thank you," he said as he looked at Sen. She smiled and then reached behind her back and undid a clasp. "And I want you to have this," she said as she pulled the choker necklace off her neck. She stepped next to him and tied it onto his belt where it hung ornamentally. "Are you sure?" he asked as he fingered the pendant. Sen nodded with a slight hum. "My mother gave it to me. She said it would keep me safe. And it has, so now I gift it to you." Bard was touched by her sincerity. She was worried about his safety, but also seemed to have this unwavering faith and trust in him. He leaned over and kissed her cheek. "Thank you," he said as he sat back. Sen put her hand to her cheek as she first stared, then smiled. "Sen?" a voice said from outside, and Bard looked over to see Amir standing there. Sen grabbed his hand and gave it a simple squeeze before leaving. Bard put the tokens around his neck and under his shirt before grabbing his fiddle. Kai was stirring and Bard headed to the entrance as Sen slipped back out. He noted that Amir shook his head before sighing. It was a look of "what am I going to do with you?" as the dryad looked at his daughter, who was grinning before she looked back, and winked at Bard before leaving. The two men stood there watching her leave before Amir then commanded the tree to open the bars. Bard held onto his fiddle as he watched the wood part. "Come," Amir said, and Bard froze. He was speaking human, or Tekka, however he wanted to describe it. War Tree waits. It was simple, basic commands, though Bard noted the lack of hostility in the tone. As the two began to walk deeper into the woods, Bard noted the many dryads who barred the way for Kai to follow as well as their silent guard. Bard was guided to a ledge where he could look out at a large magnificent tree. The winds blew and made the silvered leaves shimmer in the morning mists. Bard took in a deep breath that chilled his lungs. Amir said something in rapid dryadic and Bard pondered on the sounds. Something sounded like a wake and a rise, but he wasn't sure. At first the forest was silent, and then the sounds of creaking began to grate on his ears. The tree before him began to shift and roots emerged from the ground. Amir turned to him and smiled. "Your trial begins," he said, and then a branch from a different tree came and grabbed him, leaving Bard alone. He looked up at the now looming silvery tree and felt a sensation of awe and fear. He kept his spot and placed his fiddle to his shoulder as branches charged at him. He closed his eyes and listened to the chaos as the ground around him was struck. Small bits of debris stung his cheeks, and he peeked open his eyes to see a branch at his chest. Its sharp twist meant it was going in for the kill, but its sudden halt was what confused him. Not waiting, he began to pull the bow across the string. A long mournful sound ushered out and the tree recoiled back as if to attack again. Bard played the next series of notes and the tree before him froze as if listening. As Bard played, more sounds came around them. He briefly let his eyes wander to the sources of the sounds and noticed the animals and trees around them joining in their natural sounds. Then his eyes fell on an older face, Elwood. He was swaying with the tune. Bard pressed on and then felt a deep reverb under his feet. He continued playing and closed his eyes as the ground around him erupted. He looked out at spiraling roots that caged him in. He could see some roots poised to strike him and he faltered on the song. He then closed his eyes and focused on the music. The attacks stopped and then he heard the echoing cry of a voice hardly used. He looked out as the branches and roots left and a silvery tree shifted to the side. Behind it was a larger tree that had been obscured by the mists. Its white and silver perfectly blended in until this tree moved away. Bard repeated the song and began to harmonize with the voice and sounds he heard, adding in the notes he had been practicing. He noted the dryads that came out from their hiding spots and observed with keen interest. Then a flurry of birds flew off the larger tree and came over and circled him. They hovered and joined in the song before flying away. Bard played one final note and held it out before letting it fade into silence. The large tree shifted and quaked the ground as it began to move. Bard looked at it, till his balance was so far off that his eyes were cast downward as he knelt on the mossy ground. A whistling sound drew his gaze back up, and he saw a twisted branch aiming for him from the large tree, and he once again closed his eyes. He felt a prick at his chest and felt time slow. This is it, he thought as he figured his life would be over. One moment and then the next passed. He gradually opened his eyes, and saw the branch had broken his clothes, but stopped at the tokens. The wood gently approached and paused several times before retracting. "What is your name?" he heard in a deep and strong voice. He looked to the elder tree and then bowed. "Bard, my siblings have given you many gifts," the voice said softly, "and you too also brought a gift." Bard waited as he looked at the old tree. "Yes, I hope to bring back the song and soul that is whispered on the wind, but not sung in the heart of this forest," Bard answered after a comfortable amount of silence. "War tree." He gazed between his fiddle and the tree before him. "Long has it been since I heard it so completely," the voice continued before extending branches towards Bard in a calm and slow manner. "And you didn't fear the attacks around you. Your song to the other tree said to scare me, not harm me initially," Bard said calmly. "And for that I thank you." "I could have lied," the voice said, "as have all elders warned me. But the one who raised me promised that an elder tree will not lie, nor will it seek to harm an individual who is unarmed. Then they are wise." "Who raised you?" "Father Tree," Bard answered, and the silence stretched. "You are a child of his woods. Why would he take in a human?" Bard sighed. "Here lay his mission. He sent me here to find out how you were doing." "Something sinister roams the land," Bard said firmly. "They wiped out all my village and killed my mother as she fled into Father Tree's woods." "How old were you then?" "Only 6 years old," Bard answered. "Still tender-aged. I've roamed the land at his direction, met many elders and explored the abandoned cities at his behest. And now you are pledged to a child of my woods," the voice said with some amusement in his tone. "A happy and unexpected occurrence," Bard answered back. "Do we have your permission?" Bard asked. "Gladly, though it will be a struggle to have her gain all those tokens." Bard smiled. His life was preserved, but that would be the next challenge ahead of him. Then he recalled a question he had concerning the song, and gazed at the tops of the tree before him. "Elder," he said calmly, "this wasn't your song. It is not your soul that I played. So why is it missing from your forest?" The tree shivered and Bard noticed the surprise on Amir and Elwood. They knew. Of course the old dryad would know, but Amir? That had been a surprise. "How do you know?" Bard smiled and recalled the words of many elder trees he had grown to love. "It is the missing melody of your forest but is not to be sung by you, and I do not know its source." Bard shook his head. "Or rather, it may be that it can't be sung by you, Elwood and Amir were talking while War Tree sighed. That is an answer that will be given to you at a later time. Ask me a different question. Bard stared a bit surprised and then looked back at the growing crowd of dryads. Was it an answer that they were not to learn of? He bowed and then barreled into his other question, the one that Father Tree would want him to ask. Why are you called War Tree? Aren't the elders against all this fighting? He asked. The forest stilled and Bard felt he had asked too much. I have not felt the presence of that old tree for so long. War Tree chuckled. You do resemble your father very much. Bard smiled and took that as a compliment. I do love him very much, Bard said respectfully. The image of Father Tree played in his mind for a moment as he clutched the one token on its own string. As for the answer to that, I will have one of the dryads answer that, the voice answered, and Bard bowed his head. Amir came forward and the voice and him conversed rapidly. Bard watched the dryad's face contort with many emotions. Some seemed directed at him and others were at the tree. Bard just felt relief. Never had it felt so wonderful to be alive. As he thought back on the brief battle, he shivered, and was grateful to be on the ground. He then heard a happy howl, and looked back to see Sen riding Kai. As the two traversed the wood, Kai abruptly stopped and came at him. Sen jumped down from the wolf's back, and Bard was assaulted with a large tongue before Sen came over and hugged him. She then griped at the slobber but then hugged his tightly. It was shortly afterwards that he noticed Elwood approaching them with a gentle and happy smile. Bard smiled and then laid down on the grass. He was worn out. He had put on a brave and confident front during the exchange, but now he was worn out. It didn't help that he hardly slept. His nerves and fears were tough to tackle into submission last night, and now that the event was done, he was ready for some rest. His hand rested at his side, and he felt the necklace pendant as Sen's face came into view. He focused his eyes as he sat back up and reached to his side, undoing the clasp and holding the necklace in between them. He then reached his hand towards her, and she smiled before turning her back to him, and holding her hair into submission. Bard reached around her and returned the necklace to her. She touched the pendant as she looked back at him and grinned. Enough, Bard, lest you incite my son's rage, Elwood said as he sat next to him. Bard looked over at Amir, who didn't seem all that happy, and looked at the group with dissatisfaction. He bowed his head and then heard the elder tree's voice speak out in Dryadic. In essence, he proclaimed him a son of the forest. Bard looked at Sen and Elwood. So what happens next? He asked. You will see tomorrow, Elwood said before Sen could speak up. Bard cocked his head at the surprising answer. Grandpa, Sen shouted, and Elwood chuckled. It's not that big of a secret, but it might be a fun surprise, Sen said thoughtfully. Bard frowned. After just securing his life for the moment, he wasn't too keen on any more of her surprises, but this was the suggestion of her grandfather. Perhaps he could handle one or two more. Elwood and Sen accompanied him back to the cell where Sen insisted he rest. Grandpa, can you make sure he isn't disturbed? Sen asked. So you noticed his fatigue too? Elwood said with a slight smile. She was paying more attention to those around her. An improvement. Perhaps this boy was what she had needed to start stepping up, and into her role as guardian. He hoped so. Just for today then, Elwood said kindly before speaking to the trees, and asking them to keep the others away from the spot. Thanks, Sen said softly as they headed back to where Amir and War Tree were at. She approached the ledge and bowed on the ground before War Tree and her father. Sen, you realize you must now go and win approval with all the elders that the Tekka has received tokens from, her father said as he knelt in front of her. Yes, father, I look forward to the journey, she said gracefully. A wise child, you did well in raising her. Amir. War Tree spoke up and Sen looked up in surprise. What? Not only is her discernment impressive for spotting a well-respected individual, but she shielded and protected him from the aggressiveness of my forest children, War Tree said as he shifted and a silver bird flew off. If she can get all the tokens, she will be granted the silver horns when she comes of elderhood. Sen's eyes lit up. The silver horns hadn't been granted to anyone in ages. Only renowned elders had ever grown those, and she had a chance at achieving it. Her father looked back at her in shock and her grandpa smiled with delight. Thank you for this honor, Sen said as she bowed her head. I will attain all the tokens, she said firmly before turning and leaving with an air of grace. Elwood looked at Amir, who seemed shocked. He smiled and patted his son on the back. She is turning into a fine lady, fit to be a guardian, he said, and Amir groaned. The two paid their respects to War Tree, before heading to the place where the dryads awaited their orders. Elwood was relieved that War Tree had calmed. Perhaps he would take back his old name. Amir, however, seemed troubled by the calm War Tree. Perhaps he still hadn't forgiven them yet. As they began organizing their people for the celebration, Elwood took Amir to the side to talk. I sensed a change in you. What happened? Elwood asked, and Amir closed his eyes as he shrunk down a bit. War Tree asked that I take them to that place, Amir said, and Elwood stilled. I see. Then, I assume it will be before they begin their journey, Elwood said, and Amir nodded as they watched the dryads begin to sing and prepare everything. On another note, Amir said, and Elwood inclined his head, curious what his son wanted to know. What was it like getting those tokens? Elwood smiled, and between giving out orders and making sure everything was set, he explained his own journey to get the 8 tokens in his possession. Thinking of getting your own? Elwood asked. No, Amir said before barking out another order. Elwood paused and then smiled. Sen will be fine. I don't know what you are talking about, Amir said flatly. Elwood half chuckled. What wouldn't a father learn if they were concerned for their child? Chapter 11, Feast. Bard roused as a whimpering head kept pushing at his side and covers. He mumbled something unintelligible before rolling over and looking towards Kai. Morning, he yawned before stretching his ankles and wrists. A deep reverberating sigh escaped his lips as he melted back into the bed. Kai nuzzled him once more and he lifted his hand to pat the large head. I'm waking up. Just give me a second, Bard said calmly. Then he heard the giggle. Instantly he sat up, alert. Sen, how long have you been there? He asked as he rubbed the sleep off his face. Long enough, she said with a devious grin. Bard pulled the covers off and reached for his shoes. He panicked when they weren't there and then heard Sen's chuckle. He looked up to see the sight of the leather peeking from behind her back. All right, give them back, please, he said calmly as he bowed his head in defeat. You have to catch me first, she said as she took off. Bard looked at Kai, who tilted his head. Kai, I'll procure you something delicious if you bring her back with the shoes, he said, and Kai's tail was up as he panted happily. Bard's eyebrows raised as he indicated to Sen, and the large wolf was bounding after her. Bard heard her screams as she realized it was Kai after her rather than Bard. He shifted on the bed and folded the blankets before rolling them up nicely. Put me down, he heard Sen's voice shout, and he looked back to see a successfully captured Sen, carried like some puppy. She still held onto his shoes while looking disappointed. Kai brought her over and set her on the bed. She looked up at the wolf and stuck out her tongue. Kai ignored her and looked at Bard eager, and Bard reached over and grabbed his shoes. Better get that for you then, he said as he slipped them on and tucked the ends of his pants into the leather. Get what? Kai's bribe, Bard answered. That's unfair, Sen said, and Bard laughed. So is taking my shoes while I am asleep, he pointed out, and she squirmed under his gaze. Singing voices distracted him and he looked out at the illuminated forest. So what is going on out there? Bard asked. The feast is ready, so I came to get you, Sen said. Bard held out his hand and helped her off the bed. Then shall we get going? He asked, and she nodded. As they walked out, Sen paused and looked back. Then she swiftly turned to him and guided him to a place that took his breath away. Winding branches had shifted around the trees and formed beautiful walkways and balconies. On the lower levels there were interwoven branches creating a large gathering area. The top was canopied by large branches of silver, while glowing orbs of light hung from the branches. Many dryads welcomed them in Dryadic, and Bard smiled as Sen guided him to a large table of sorts. She sat next to him and some dryads approached them and placed feathers in his hair. Bard noticed the feathers were also in the hair of Elwood and Amir, and a few notable-looking dryads, but not everyone. What are the feathers for? He quietly asked Sen. You know how the birds are connected to the elder trees. We collect the feathers and they are placed in the hair of those who are considered full children of the forest, she said with a grin. Bard thought on it and smiled. They sat next to one another the whole feast. Bard learned from Sen how to eat using their utensils and followed some of her manners, as she explained how to be around the others. Bard found it easier to follow along than he had anticipated. He remembered father's mentions about table manners, and how different groups had different things that were appropriate and not. His mind then wandered, and he was grateful for the times he and Sen had met in the forest. She had seemed appalled at his manners, and he assumed that was part of why she was so diligently explaining things to him. He also noted it was mostly in the human tongue, probably for his benefit. When she used words he was surprised she knew. She looked towards her grandfather and he sighed in relief. The two, no doubt, had been preparing for this. The dryad sung and began to play games that fascinated Bard. Most were about skill, but a few were about strength. Some were games of accuracy and targets, while others were skills that were mostly entertainment. Bard laughed with Sen at some of the spectacles. The feast lasted the whole day and Bard was relieved to be retiring to his cell, where it was nice and calm. As they entered, he noticed all his missing supplies stacked neatly in the corner, and he felt an unimaginable relief as he saw them. Sen chuckled and he shook his head. "It's just stuff," she said, and Bard froze. "Sen, you've grown up where most everything is available to you. But I had to gather and make everything I have. And it's a little more important to me than just stuff. It's why I am able to be here in the first place, and how I have traveled so much. In a way, it's like a friend that I've been missing." "Okay." Her words sounded doubtful and Bard sighed. "You'll understand a bit better when we travel to meet the elders," he said as he patted her head. She had a little pout on her lips, but she nodded and then shrugged. "Just so you know," she said as she rocked on her feet, "we'll be leaving in 2 days." She said and Bard nodded. He would need those days gathering supplies and getting ready. He also needed to check that his things were still in good repair, and would need to figure out how to pack everything now that there was one more on his journey. "So, how can I help?" Sen asked and Bard looked at her curiously. "Your face said you were planning something, so..." Yes. I need to get supplies and pack everything so we can travel easily. I can help with the supplies." "I'm sure you could. I need forest craft supplies. I used up most of it before coming here." "Great. Any in particular?" "Fireweed, sulfur plume, indauis, and catharise are the ones I need the most of." "About enough to fill?" He looked around and spotted the forest craft bags. "These." He held the bags up for her to see and she nodded. After that, he began to detail the other herbs and useful materials he would need to restock. She was surprised by the volume, both in the small quantity of each, while at how many different varieties there were. "I'll write that down so I don't forget it," she said, and she sung to the tree to shed some of its bark for her to write on. She went out and grabbed a bit of blackstone and scribed what he had described to her. When she was gone, he began sorting through the things and wondered how to adjust the packs and saddle so she could ride with him, if they needed. As he began to lay the things out, he inspected the instruments for damage. The loss wasn't much, a few bells and chimes that he could easily replace, but they would need to take a detour into one of the abandoned cities for the materials. The thought of those places was enough to make him shiver. Their empty nature wasn't just that they were abandoned, it was also a host for the shades and made it eerily quiet, since most animals wouldn't even go near them. Perhaps he could do that near the end of their journey, or if a wandering tribe or army was nearby. Not even those violent types were brave enough to head in there. Without his tokens, he doubted he would have had the courage to enter. It was like a death trap in there. "I got the supplies," Sen said, and Bard thanked her before sending her back home to sleep. He packed things away before heading to bed himself, decidedly hiding his shoes from their regular resting spot. Chapter 12, A Promise and Revelation. The next morning he found Sen snooping around and he tried not to chuckle. "Looking for something?" he asked, and she stiffened. "Good morning," she said with a sheepish grin. "Morning. Ready to do a trial pack?" he asked as he brought his shoes out from their hiding spot. He watched her eyes as they lit, and she realized he anticipated her trying to take them again. "Sure," she said, hardly missing a beat. "How can I help?" Bard put on his shoes and tucked in the pants like always. "See those bags over there? We're going to lay them out as if they were on Kai's back." "How does that go?" she asked, and Bard chuckled. "I'll show you." He got up and grabbed a bite to eat from one of the packs before pulling them around and laying them out, one row being the lower left side, and then another based on how he would stack them going up the sides. He then situated the things he wanted on top and explained why things were in certain places. Kai needed mobility and comfort, while his things needed to not be smashed should the wolf tumble or stumble. or not pay attention to where he was in relation to a tree. Sounds like that has happened before, Sen commented, and Bard sighed. He remembered the smashed instrument that had slipped to the side. Kai hadn't noticed, and that was a costly accident. A few too many times, he said, and Kai whimpered apologetically. So if you've got it figured out, why do we need to test it? She asked. Because I've not traveled with anyone else before, Bard pointed out, and she looked at him confused. Why would that make a difference? She asked, and Bard sighed as he pointed his gaze skyward. She probably hadn't traveled out of the forest in her entire life. You'll understand after a few days of experience, he said with finality. Fine. But she seemed to be concentrating, so Bard began to rearrange some of his things. Some of his more precious instruments he had stored near where he liked to sit. But that spot would be taken up by Sen. Let me be useful, she said, and Bard paused what he was doing and looked back at her. You want to be useful? He asked. Useful how? I can sing to the trees and help. We can figure that out over time. But I want this to also be my journey to get the tokens. Bard smiled and set what he was working on down. He knelt in front of her, coming eye level with her. You've been plenty helpful. But I will keep that in mind as we travel, he said calmly, and Sen blushed before nodding mutely. He started back to the pile and then paused and stepped. By the way, Sen, on this journey, I'd like to propose a few things. Like what? She asked. First, we don't touch each other unless necessary. And second, I want us to share a story about ourselves each night. Oh, I get the first one, but why the second? If I'm to be marrying you in the future, I want to get to know you better. Bard answered simply as he shifted some things around. Conversely, you know some things about me. But I think it would be better if we really understand one another. This is how I think we can do that. We've got a whole year of stories to share, and that is something else to look forward to. Besides, when we are on the open road, it might be easy to stop talking to one another, so I'm trying to prevent that. And how would you know that? You haven't traveled with others? She asked, and he chuckled. That will be a story I can share later. But for now, I didn't always travel alone. Sen pouted. Fine, I get your point. Now come over here and help me move these around. Bard chuckled. Sen eagerly assisted him, and at the end they called Kai over. What do you think, Kai? Bard asked as the wolf paced around the layout. He looked this way and that for a while before laying down. I appreciate the vote of confidence, but we really should get you suited up just to make sure, Bard said, and Kai's head perked up. The wolf then quickly dashed away. Kai, looks like he's been spoiled not having to carry all that around. Sen chuckled and Bard groaned. This would take some convincing. Bard and Sen managed to coax the wolf into letting them just set things on and sit on his back before unloading him, and letting him run around the woods. As they finished, and while Sen was laughing at something Bard had said, Elwood appeared and bowed to Bard. Our elder tree wishes to speak with you. Sen, you are welcome to come as well, he said, and Bard felt a sudden seriousness come on them. They quietly followed, and Bard felt the forest humming with a new life. Welcome, Bard, War Tree said as they came to the place where he was attacked. I greet the elder War Tree, Bard said respectfully. War Tree seemed to laugh at his remarks. It seems Father Tree taught you well, and this is part of the discussion I wish to have with you before you leave tomorrow. Bard looked up at the silvery tree and then bowed. Whatever it is you wish to share, there will be no judgments, as is the wish of Father Tree who sent me, Bard said with deep reverence. He heard War Tree chuckle and its leaves shook without wind. My name is not War Tree, that was but a title that I gave myself when I sought to protect this forest during the war. This is something not even the younger generation are aware of, War Tree said as Bard looked back at Sen. He briefly glanced at Elwood and noticed the dryad was smiling a sad, relieved smile. Is it your wish to share your name with me? Bard asked. It is, particularly since you are the one who revived this forest with that song. War Tree shifted closer and seemed to settle into the soil as an old man who is sitting down on the floor. My name originally was Defender. When you leave tomorrow, you will learn the reasons why these changed. For now, I wish to convey my blessing to you and will give sense when you both return. Bard sat down and watched as the tree shivered before branches came towards him. Take this token from me. May it be a help to you in your journeys. Use it if you are in need of extra protection, Defender said. "Thank you, Defender. It is well received," Bard said as he held out his hand to take the token hanging from the branch. Sen came over and looked at it in his hands. The silver piece of wood was beautiful to behold, and the ever-present markings and shape of these tokens was like always. Bard brought it close to his heart and then pulled out the others. He undid the knot and added the token to the bunch before putting it around his neck. Then he bowed to the tree. "You may be on your way now. There is still much to prepare," Defender said. Bard turned to leave before he tapped the tip of his foot a few times. Defender chuckled and Bard smiled. He figured the old tree would understand that simple gesture. They returned to the cell and Bard was surprised by the dryads that were finishing up a song to change the place into something less cell-like and more homey. Kai greeted them and Bard made sure his things were all still there before eating a hearty meal that had been left for him. "Tekka don't say pledged," Sen said as she chewed on some food. Bard's ears perked up at this. "No, they don't. So what is the word they say?" she asked. Bard paused. There wasn't a word that came close to the meaning the dryads gave to pledged. There were words that were used for the time when couples were intended to marry. He sighed. The closest word would be engaged. He bit into some food and watched her attempt to say it a few times. He corrected her till she said it right, and tried not to laugh at how the dryadic sense still seemed to be present. "Why is engaged the closest word?" Sen asked and Bard swallowed before speaking. "It's engaged, and humans look more at survival of the fittest, so they don't have a year journey before that point. And pledged seem to be more life and death, and serious than being engaged. But couples are supposed to support one another like that. Human lives are short and very fragile. We die pretty easily. It's not uncommon for someone to marry another one after the first spouse dies." Sen looked confused. "I'm going to guess your father never remarried," he said, and Sen shook her head. "Though Grandpa did ask him to more recently. But Dad said no, otherwise what was his pledge for?" "That's a noble sentiment, but what would happen if you died?" "He would be without a descendant, unless you have a sibling hiding somewhere," Bard playfully teased. Sen laughed. "No, I would likely have found them if they existed, or I could have gotten Grandpa to tell me. As for your question, pledged is more serious and more respected than the word engaged." Sen looked out as if contemplating what he had said. "That's sad," she said, and then quietly returned to eating the remaining food with him. "Well, if we are around other humans, I won't use the word pledged. It will be engaged, but I will mean it as if it was pledged." Bard smiled. He understood that sentiment. He still found it weird that he was pledged to a dryad, but if it was her, perhaps it wouldn't be all that bad. She then proceeded to try to feed him since he had stopped, and he laughed before he shooed Sen away. It was getting late. While he prepared for bed, he set out the tokens on his bed and looked them over, recalling each of the elders he had received them from. Then his hand grazed over the necklace that held Father's token and he paused. He would be excited to see the old tree again. It had been many years and he missed his wise words and counsel. He also would have so much to share. Best to leave that near the end so he could spend as much time as he could in those woods before returning with Sen. The wedding seemed so far away, but he knew better. Time would fly if he didn't pay attention, and that was the last thing he needed. He stretched and gently tucked the tokens into his shoes before laying down and drifting to sleep. Chapter 13, The Scares of War. Bard hummed as he scanned over his things. Knowing that they were to be leaving today, he had risen earlier than normal. Kai sat comfortably next to Bard as he looked over his gear, once again to make sure it was all in order. "Well, looks like everything is here and ready," Bard said to Kai. Kai looked up with a pleading expression. "Oh, come on, Kai. You've had over a week without having to carry anything." Bard picked up the saddle and turned to Kai, who promptly jumped back and ran to the far end of the room. "Kai, you're acting like a child, and you promised," Bard said, trying to chase after his friend. Unfortunately, Kai's speed and agility that Bard had so often relied on was now against him. The game of cat and mouse continued, although the odds were not evenly stacked. The two became so enthralled in the game that neither one of them noticed the new arrival in the room. "Now boys, is that any way to act in front of a lady?" Both Kai and Bard stopped and turned to see Sen standing in the doorway with her hands on her hips and a mock, serious expression on her face. Bard, seeing an opportunity, threw down the saddle, jumped on Kai's back and began doing his best to try and topple the large beast. Kai stood there unmoving as the young man wrapped his arms around his neck and threw his weight back and forth in order to throw him off balance. Kai's sheer size and wide stance made such attempts futile. After a moment, Kai rolled his eyes and sat down on his haunches, accepting his defeat. Bard rolled off Kai's back a little, winded, and turned to Sen. "Sorry about that," he said in between breaths. "Please come in." Sen, who up to this point had maintained her serious expression, now broke into a wide grin and bounded into the room. She walked over to Kai, while Bard grabbed the saddle and began strapping it on the large animal. "Now Kai, what are you doing letting that mean Tekka catch you?" Sen said as she patted his head. "Hey, whose side are you on?" Bard complained, looking up from his work. Sen smiled at him, saying, "Well, now that we're caged, I have to be on your side." Bard chuckled. Sen had gotten a lot better at speaking in the human tongue, but she still struggled with that word. "What?" she asked. He shook his head. "You're getting better, but it's really engaged," he pointed out. She pouted, but there was a mischievous glint in her eyes. Before she could rebuttal his comment, there was a knock at the entryway and Bard stiffened as he saw the golden hair of Sen's father. His serious expression made the air feel cold, and he struggled to continue with strapping the gear onto Kai. He heard her father say words in Dryadic and could make out Tekka, and something he believed said tell, but he sighed. While Sen had done wonderfully trying to learn his language, he had slowed, particularly when it came to speed, something her father was very proficient at. This experience stiffened his resolve to learn more of her language, and how her people's nuances changed it. Sen eventually turned around and half smiled at Bard. "Father says you need to follow him. He has something to show you before we go." Bard stilled. He wondered what sort of demands Amir would make of him, though if he was just showing him something, what was the purpose? Eventually he moved his feet and followed after Amir. Amir eventually stopped and whistled. Bard felt his jaw drop as two white deer came out from behind some trees. "Get on," Amir said, and Bard followed as the dryad climbed onto the back of the larger one while he climbed onto the back of the other. Amir whistled, and the deer took off and began to traverse the wood as easily as Kai would have. Bard held on as best he could and was grateful for his experience riding Kai. They then began to climb up the side of a large hill, and continued along it for several minutes. The trees gave way for a bit. Bard saw a mountain ahead of them and Amir whistled to guide the deer towards it. Bard grabbed the bit of fur that his fingers could grasp as they began to scale it. When they slowed at the top, Bard let his eyes wander, wondering where they were headed. He froze as his eyes beheld black. It wasn't the same as a shade, but the color instilled a sense of fear and despair he was all too familiar with. Amir slowly guided the deer towards the edge where the trees gave way to this black, and into the silent grounds. A few small animals scurried at the edge, but as they descended further into this place, the less they saw of them. Finally they came to a large blackened tree. Amir stepped off and Bard followed suit. He came next to Amir as the deer left them. "What happened here?" Bard asked, keeping his hand on father's token. There wasn't a lot of shadows here, but he couldn't help but shiver. The idea that this might be a trap began to cross his mind. He stilled the idea. He was pledged and had the blessing of the forest too. He should be safe. "You asked why war Defender changed his name?" Amir said. Bard's mouth formed an O as he quietly looked at the place a bit differently. "If it's easier, you can explain it in Dryadic. Though, if you could do it slowly, that would help me understand it better," Bard said in the best Dryadic he could muster. "You never cease to amaze," Amir said back, and Bard was thankful the obvious slowing of his words. "So what did happen?" he asked again. "This used to be my home," Amir said softly, "before the Tekka came and burned it down. And this tree was Defender's sister." Bard looked about the forest. He could sense what Amir was saying, but why hadn't anything grown here since? Amir seemed to imply that what he talked about was shortly after Sen was born. Bard knelt down as a bit of white caught his eyes and he rubbed at the dirt. He felt the unnatural gritty white material and closed his eyes. Saltstone. This land was decimated and probably wouldn't heal for a long while still. The wind blew, picking up some of the dust and charred material. Bard covered his eyes against the wind and waited while Amir collected his thoughts. The dryad's hair moved with the wind, an unnatural occurrence. "You are rather quiet. What are you thinking?" "Nothing much." Just listening, Bard answered. Amir snorted a disappointed sound. Typical. Bard watched Amir stride to a charred log and sit down, looking annoyed. What made Defender change? Bard asked, and Amir looked at him with confusion and disbelief. I told you, his sister was killed, burned by the Tekka, Amir reinstated. Bard sighed. And it was just that. Amir sat there quietly. Bard knew that it took more than something like that to change the ways of an elder. They saw more time and more passings than even the eldest of dryads. Their patience was tempered and their understanding was sound. A small event like that wouldn't be enough, Bard mused as he closed his eyes. Just how well do you know elder trees? Amir asked. I was raised by one, from the age of 6 years, and I've met many others, Bard answered. Amir seemed to eye the tokens and sighed a guttural sigh of defeat before looking skyward. Yes, that was the final straw. After years of wars and with the unification of these woods to survive, Defender went to look for a place farther from the humans, and when we all returned the forest was burned, his sister barely holding on long enough to explain what had happened. The Tekka had taken many dryadic women and guardians with them, and when we arrived to save them, they were disfigured beyond what words can describe, including, Amir paused, a pained look on his face. Bard closed his eyes, trying not to imagine the sight. Sen's mother? Bard supplied, and he looked to see Amir gritting his teeth. I'm sorry. Amir shook his head and looked at him with a fierce anger that was barely contained. If you dare harm her, you'll face a fate worse than death, Amir said, and Bard bowed his head as he placed his hand by his tokens. I will remember that. I promise to take care of her. This pledge will be honored, Bard said solemnly. Amir somewhat smiled, perhaps touched by the gesture, but his disgusted face returned and he looked out at the charred landscape. Bard stared at that same landscape and then he reached for the tokens. An old memory stirred, and he grabbed them with as much reverence as he could. He moved to the old charred elder and found a bit of bark that still held its form. He pulled it back and the sound garnered the attention of Amir. What? Stop, do not interfere with the ways of the elders, Bard glared at Amir. This practice may be old, but he had thought the dryads would recognize it. Amir gritted his teeth and his eyes glared back with unrestrained suspicion and scorn. Bard walked past him and pulled loose a single string from his clothes. He then loosened a strand on his hip and a small metal spike came out. He took it in hand, noting Amir's ever-present stare. After using it to make a small hole, he threaded the bark with the string and put the metal spike back in its place. Then he moved to a boulder and placed the makeshift token on it. He then quietly took a few steps back, and with the other tokens in hand, he closed his hand, and let the tokens hang. With the little bit of wind, their melodies hummed on the strings, ready for the next moments. Bard opened his eyes and raised the tokens before spinning them around. The forced air caused a mixture of humming that soon reached a harmonious sound. As soon as the sound stabilized, Bard moved. He couldn't move the same as a tree, let alone an elder tree. But he could still move the way Father Tree and the elders had approved. With the sound as his backdrop, he shifted and moved, almost like a dance. The wind shifted and a few slight sounds came from the makeshift token before silencing. The last call of the lost ones. Bard stopped moving and then slowed the tokens till it was silent, a final parting from the elders. He then took the token from its stone dais, and proceeded to bury it at the base of the tree. Amir watched silently. Bard noted his countenance was far more at peace now. As Bard finished and wiped his hands clean of the dirt, Amir bowed his head to him. Forgive me, Bard. I thought ill of you. Thank you for that. Do you know of the significance of those with tokens? Bard asked. Amir stood up straight and looked at him questioningly. No. To act as an elder when none is present or able to perform their rites. To carry on the knowledge and teach the rising generation in their ways. And to protect the lives of those to come, Bard answered. This is the way of those acknowledged by the forest. Amir closed his eyes as if contemplating something deeply. Forgive my rudeness, Bard. He bowed respectfully. Well said, another voice said, drawing their attention to a brander that came quickly over. We are well met, Elder Bard. Elwood jumped down, still as spry as a young man. You surprise me in your knowledge, especially for one so young. But I shouldn't be surprised with all those tokens in your possession. You knew, Amir said startled. Your ignorance is going to be your downfall, Elwood chided. The forest and trees whispered of your conversation and birds told of your hostility. I came, but heard word of the rite, so instead, I've come to offer my thanks." "Thanks?" Bard asked, trying to avoid the evident family problems. He would deal with it if he made it back in time. Now was not the time. Indeed, I could not perform such a fantastic rite, and Defender had forgotten his ways so that he was unfit to perform it himself. "Though, I am surprised to hear of your dance. If I had but arrived a bit earlier, I would have loved to learn it. Perhaps I will teach it to you when I return," Bard said with a friendly smile. "That would be fine. I have still many years left to live, no doubt longer than you." Elwood's friendly demeanor and comfortable atmosphere spoke volumes, that he was very much in agreement to have him join the family. Amir seemed grumpy at best about this. "Now I'm sure I've ruined the good feelings you had towards Bard," Elwood said as he looked at Amir. "But Sen also sends word. She is ready and waiting to depart. I showed her all the locations you will need to go, and she was quite shocked at how little time you two have." "What is this about?" Amir asked, and Elwood chuckled. "I did warn you that all those tokens will be challenging. 15, and now you will be getting 16 of them. It's a marvel that you have so many. I should consider you my older brother of the forest," Elwood chuckled. "Father," Amir warned, and Elwood smiled. "I may have had an impressive amount in my day, but I only managed to get 8. You must have been traveling most of your life and taught well to receive much." Bard nodded. It was rare to have anyone know the effort and depths it took to receive these. There was a certain kinship that those sort of challenges gave to those who completed them. "Someday, when you return, I ask that you teach me what you know from the elders." There was a wistful excitement in his voice. "But for now, I am going to take you back to where the lovely Sen is waiting." "Father," Amir said, and Elwood laughed again. His eagerness had nearly caused him to overlook the other dryad who was present. "Bard, promise me you two will return in time," Amir said, and Bard smiled before bowing as respectfully as he knew how to. "Amir, by my breath and the protection of Shady Woods, I will bring her back in time."